Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where wonder moves slowly, and science is allowed to breathe like a tide without hurry. Tonight, we are going to drift into one of the most silent and haunting riddles written into the stone of our world. A riddle that belonged not to fire or eruption, not to storms or collisions, but to something colder, quieter, and infinitely more patient. What if the Earth froze? Not just winter, not just frost, but an entire planet arrested in glacial silence. What if the rivers stopped, the seas stiffened into glass, and the very sky dimmed into a timeless frost? It may feel like a question fit more for dream or myth, a world wrapped in ice, pale and still. Yet the more we sit with the image, the more we begin to sense it as real memory, a truth whispered by rocks and isotopes, fossils and sediments. The Earth carries it with certainty, as though in its deep memory, the story of ice is always ready to speak when we are quiet enough to listen. And so, with you listening gently tonight, we step into that memory together. Before we go too far, I wonder, where are you resting right now? Do you listen close to the hiss of waves on a shoreline, or miles inland where the sea is little more than an idea? If you've stood beside a frozen lake at dusk, or leaned over a river in midwinter when ice races along the surface, you may have felt a glimpse of this memory already. A surface stiffening, a breath held too long, a quiet pause in the great turning of things. Scale that stillness upward, not just across a lake or hill, but across continents, across oceans, across everything. That is the picture we begin with. Imagine the oceans locked beneath a seamless pane of ice. Imagine continents hidden beneath glaciers thicker than mountains. In this world, silence doesn't simply fill the air. Silence becomes the air. Winds carry little but cold dust. Sound itself is muffled by endless snow. What kind of history could unfold in such a place? What kind of memory could possibly survive when everything seems to have slowed to almost nothing? Science points us to these ancient moments with clues too delicate to ignore. Oxygen isotopes, preserved in tiny pockets within stone, tilt their balance toward colder leanings. A frozen snapshot kept like an icy signature. Rocks ground into fine powder by vanished glaciers whisper their scars as testimony. Even magnetic signatures in layered sediments record the intervals of stillness and thaw, as though trying not to let us forget. These signals tell us that something vast did happen. Maybe not once, but many times. Our planet shivered, and the memory was carved into its very skin. But the reality is stranger still. It wasn't always a total snowball, perhaps. Some oceans, under their surface glass, may have flowed quietly. Some vents may have still issued warmth, and tiny, stubborn organisms clung to those oases of heat. Life refusing to go, even as ice climbed across the edges of the Earth. The thought is humbling, that even under the heaviest silence, life would not surrender. Not because it conquers, but because it waits. Because it knows how to take shelter in shadows, to persist where entropy seems final. Sometimes we wonder about extinction as finality, as a sealed door, but perhaps extinction itself is also a kind of pause, a wandering silence before something different answers the stillness. When the world froze, some species were erased, yet others continued quietly, as if endurance itself was a language that Earth would preserve. And the deeper we look into geology, the clearer this language becomes. Not written in letters or scrolls, but in scars, in dust, in isotopes that never stopped counting while everything else was at rest. When you hold a cold stone in your hand, heavy and silent, it's easy to forget that it is an archive. That within it rests the frozen eternity of isotope trails, the fingerprints of volcanic breaths, the shadow of an ancient sun dimmed by ice. And these archives tell us that the fossil record thins in these frozen times. Many traces vanish, whole spans of memory left faint or erased. This is the hidden cost of ice. Silence not only in the moment, but silence in the record of memory itself. Whole ecosystems lost not only to extinction but to forgetting. Still, the very presence of such gaps is its own testimony. If there is silence, something silenced it. If there are gaps, something carved them open. Story hides even in absence. So the question lingers, how much have we truly forgotten? If the Earth can lose memory of entire ages, entire pulses of life, then how secure is our trust in history? Could civilizations, if they had ever risen so early, be hidden beneath those miles of ice? Could the glacier itself have become an eraser, not a preserver? Science tells us this is unlikely, but still we can't help but ask. What might vanish without us ever knowing it was there? Entropy loves silence. But entropy is never truly still. Even within the ice, molecules danced, fractured, shifted. Energy decayed in imperceptible degrees, carving its slow fingerprints on minerals. Time continued, but it felt muted, wrapped in endless hush. Imagine walking across such a landscape. Only white, only winds, only dust blowing faintly where no voices had room to echo. It seems uninhabitable for sound, for memory, for us. And yet, even in such landscapes, beauty continued to form. Crystals arranged themselves into endless symmetry under pressure and calm. Snow fell in fragile spirals, patterns repeated until they became immortalized within layers, waiting for some far future hand to drill into them and read their silence. Perhaps this is why the first great ice ages invite such awe. They weren't simply destructions. They were architectures. They shaped valleys, sculpted ridges, laid the foundation for rivers that would not yet appear for millennia. Ice is not gentle, but it is deeply patient. It sculpted continents as if they were soft clay, adding and erasing in cycles. And when we look at the maps of modern geology, at the scars of erosion and curving fjords, we can trace the artist's hand and realize how much of what we call home was shaped in frozen silence. So we sit with this picture now. A planet nearly locked, a memory of stillness imprinted onto rock. And we let ourselves drift into the question that inevitably rises when faced with this immensity. If the world has frozen before and thawed and frozen again, then what does that mean for the balance we inhabit now? Are we living in the fragile warmth between shivers? Are we breathing in a pause within a cycle that is far older than us? Could the planet already be carrying the seeds of its next silence? And yet, if this much can be lost, erased, or hidden beneath miles of quiet, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps, to follow that question, we must go back even further, to the first time the Earth felt the breath of cold slide across its skin. Long before the frozen silence of deep glaciation, there was a shiver. The planet did not seize all at once, trembled gently, as if testing the idea of frost. A subtle cooling, born not from stillness but from motion. Volcanoes venting gas into the sky, currents shifting in the swell of primitive seas, layers of atmosphere experimenting with a strange balance of warmth and chill. In that earliest tremor of climate, the Earth began to remember that it could change. The rocks tell us this not through words but through chemistry. Traces of carbon dioxide reduced, trapped in sediments, folded deep by the slow jaws of plate tectonics. Islands of black basalt, worn into red soils by long exposure, pulled greenhouse gases from air with such quiet insistence that the planet's own sky began to thin of warmth. In those moments, entropy took a new form. Not just the slow decay of energy, but the draining of heat from an entire world. The seas shifted too. They folded upon themselves, driven by the restless churning of the deep mantle below. Ocean ridges rose, subduction zones swallowed their crust, and with every rearrangement of land and water, flows of energy altered. What seemed like endless summer for a young Earth tilted gradually toward uncertainty. Salt crystals preserved in shallow basins whisper of waters that once evaporated differently, as if the very cycles of dissolution and evaporation had caught the first notes of a colder rhythm. It is gentle evidence, the kind easily overlooked, and yet when we lean close to the record of stone, the message becomes clear. Even fossils, faint and incomplete from these early ages, tell us the story in their own absence. Stromatolites, layered domes of ancient microbial life, thinned in their abundance, as if life itself flinched at the first touch of frost. In this way, silence speaks again, not because there is much to show, but because there is less. Was life pressed downward, forced into vents and shadows? Even then, Could it be that the very concept of survival on Earth was shaped first not by warmth but by the lack of it? When we study isotopic trails, especially the ratios of oxygen preserved in crystals, we see hints of these earliest shivers with surprising clarity. The balance between the heavier and lighter oxygen atoms shifts in rhythm with temperature. They are frozen notes in a planetary symphony. To hold such a rock is to touch not only matter, but memory. The isotope does not exaggerate. It simply remembers without choice, without opinion. These are traces of truth carried across billions of years, faint but faithful. And they whisper to us of times when the world carried less breath, less heat, less shelter. It makes you wonder, what is the shape of a shiver at the scale of a planet? We know the shape of a human breath catching in winter, the glimmer of frost on a window pane, the quick contraction of the body against the air. But Earth's shiver is slower, longer, far more patient. This twitching lasts not seconds but centuries. This pause stretches over millennia, and yet the metaphor still rings true. Earth, like us, knows tremble and hesitation. Earth, like us, knows how to stutter between warmth and silence. Volcanoes rise again in this story, paradoxical in role. They gave heat to the surface even as they breathed gases that stole it away. Lava hardened into black ribbons, cooling quickly, dissolving into chemical weathering that drew carbon from the sky. Balance reversed itself. Oceans reflected brighter, less able to absorb the shallow light of the sun. And there the tipping began, the first soft edge of ice. Maybe only at the poles, maybe only in high valleys, yet still it marked the beginning of a memory Earth would repeat. A small experiment in global chill, a rehearsal for the later silence of full glaciation. And so we ask, if such small shifts could invite such vast consequence, how precarious is the balance now? Could a handful of volcanoes tilt us one way, a drift of continents another? Was it chance, accident, inevitability? Perhaps deep time is not ruled by singular events but by accumulations of whispers that eventually become a roar. Or maybe not a roar at all, but a hush like the first ice, spreading slowly, unrelenting but soft. When rivers first began to stiffen, when clouds first thickened with ash and crystal, when seas exchanged their warmth for stillness, the earth learned fragility. It learned that climate can break. It learned that time is not even, but fractured by thresholds, by sudden veils of silence fallen over endless ages. And in those moments, memory was carved. Geology began to hold not just the story of heat, but of loss. Tonight, as we drift here together, we feel a part of that memory. We breathe a thin line carved by their lessons, knowing that fragility is not new, that long before us, long before forests or rivers or birds, the planet trembled at its own horizon. And if that shiver was the first, it was only one of many still to come. And as we look closer into this moment of unrest, into the faint beginning of cold, we must ask ourselves what silence first fell over the earth in those times. For if the planet's first shiver altered its fate so deeply, then where else might these tremors of change be hidden, waiting? And so, if the planet's first shiver signaled a fragile beginning, then what followed was a deeper stillness, a greater experiment with silence. Imagine now that the oceans themselves, the restless lungs of Earth, unfolded a veil of ice across their surface. From horizon to horizon, the seas froze, not in thin skins of winter frost, but in layers upon layers, thick as mountains and heavy as the sky itself. To gaze upon such a planet from afar would have been to see a mirror stretched across the globe, a reflection of pale sunlight bouncing from a world almost unrecognizable. A planet encased not in flame, but in frozen glass. Yet even in this vision of timeless cold, the story is more complicated. Beneath the locked surface, the oceans may still have stirred. Deep currents, hidden from daylight, may have carried faint ribbons of warmth along trenches and plains. Energy still seeped upward from the planet's interior, from vents where heat and minerals bubbled into blackness, cutting small sanctuaries into the otherwise relentless chill. And there, in those unexpected shadows, life persisted, not flourishing, not vibrant, but holding on. Microbes gathered in whispers near the heat, clinging to rocks and minerals, weaving fragile webs of survival in places where sunlight had long since vanished. It is humbling to realize that entire worlds of life may have folded themselves into such secret corners. Not because they chose to, but because there was nowhere else left to go. And what they preserved was not just themselves, but memory. Memory of resilience, of continuity, of an ancient promise that even when the surface world closed like a locked door, something below would keep the flame alive. Perhaps survival is not always loud or bold. Perhaps survival is silence itself, waiting patiently beneath. Geology tells us that such oceans beneath glass were not absolute stillness. Salt layers recorded cycles of concentration and release. Subduction carried old ocean crust deep into Earth's body, returning its chemistry into molten memory, only to erupt again as volcanic breath against the prison of ice from above. Entropy, too, played its role here, not through fire but through the simple, unending truth of imbalance. Heat escaped into cold, gradients equalized, and in the balancing, structures shifted. Crystals formed in dark water. Minerals arranged themselves by rules written into physics billions of years old. Nothing may live as we do in such places, yet even without life, the ocean continued to work, continued to change. Imagine placing your ear against the ice above such seas. Though no sound would meet you, the silence itself becomes a kind of voice. Because silence speaks when contrast surrounds it. Ice holds an echo not of sound, but of compression and time. Could it be that silence is a form of recording? Could the frozen oceans have held not only life, but also memory, layered in density and duration, waiting for the day they would break and reveal themselves? And then wonder deepens, for under glassy stillness, the familiar rules of time itself feel altered. Fossils from such eras are rare, faint, almost erased. And so, when we look back, we see only fragments. A trace of an organism here, a mineral imbalance there. What if whole networks of life existed, unseen and unrecorded, erased not by extinction alone but by time's refusal to preserve icebound whispers? We can only speculate, but sometimes, speculation is the only tool we have to feel the immensity of what has been forgotten. These ancient oceans remind us of fragility, but also of paradox. Ice can erase, but it can shelter too. The frozen surface did not only smother, it shielded what lay beneath from meteor strikes, ultraviolet burn, or violent storms. Life beneath ice may have been more secure in its shadows than life above. Perhaps, then, the glass that seemed like a prison was also a guardian. Not because it meant survival for all, but because it gave survival to some, when survival might otherwise have vanished completely. To close your eyes and drift into this imagery is to picture an alien world. A planet you might not recognize as Earth. A mirror everywhere, a pale silence across the curve of oceans, but within that apparent stillness, warmth still breathing quietly into the abyss. Life clinging to volcanic oases in the black, never seeing the sun, perhaps never imagining anything more. Could it be that the first chapters of the story of endurance were written here, below the ice, where no light fell? We wonder too about memory, about how the oceans remember themselves. Today we drill ice cores that tell stories of atmosphere, of shifting chemistry, of climates long gone. But what about the deep oceans under glass? What archives remain of their secret lives? Their pages are less accessible, folded away beneath tectonic subduction, under layers of crust recycled back into heat. Maybe those oceans took their secrets with them. Maybe every forgotten epoch lies not only in stone but in the water that swelled above it, water that no longer exists as it once did. And here, too, we see how perception falters. To us, oceans are vast, open, restless spaces, forever moving and reflecting sky. But to imagine an ocean frozen, sealed over entirely, changes our sense of what an ocean is. It is no longer movement. It is containment. It is no longer surface horizon. It is depth locked in. Could the very identity of a planet change when its seas are held captive beneath glass? And if so, what does that mean for us, who live by the grace of liquid oceans, who nourish ourselves from their generosity, but also take for granted their endurance? The oceans beneath glass remind us that nothing is guaranteed, that every rhythm we accept now, waves rushing against rocks, tides sweeping the shore, storms rising from salt water, could all be fleeting performances, fragile interludes in a greater, colder score. Just as the shiver began slowly, and the freeze encased a living world, so too could change arrive again, subtle at first, then all-encompassing. Perhaps the silence of ancient oceans is not truly behind us. Perhaps it is a future rehearsal waiting to repeat. And yet, even as we imagine seas locked under ice, we also lean forward into the question left unresolved. If oceans could hide life in such fragile shadows, then what other memories might they conceal? Could there be stories drowned not by ice, but by time itself? And if oceans could conceal their secrets beneath unbroken panes of ice, then what of the lands themselves, where silence came not as a covering, but as a weight that moved? When ice thickened over continents, it did not rest still. It advanced slowly, relentlessly, grinding across the raw face of Earth. Glaciers became rivers made of silence, moving not by rushing water but by the slow crush of crystals under their own immense weight. They pressed forward for centuries without pause, carving valleys, dragging mountains into shapes they had never known, leaving behind scars that spoke more eloquently than words ever could. To walk across such a landscape after the retreat of ice would have been to wander through a book already half-written. Valleys U-shaped by the steady hand of frozen rivers, granite polished to a strange reflective sheen, boulders dropped like punctuation in places where they had no belonging. Every groove, every stranded stone was a mark in Earth's unfinished diary, sentences of pressure, chapters of silence. For geology does not write with ink, but with weight and abrasion. We inherit those writings not by reading, but by tracing them with our eyes, our hands, and our wonder. The grooves that glaciers left are not shallow. They run deep into the rock, sometimes so straight, so sharp, that it seems for a moment as though a deliberate tool carved them. And yet, the only sculptor was patience, the kind measured in tens of thousands of years. Perhaps that is the lesson of ice. Not that change comes quickly, but that over endless repetition, even silence can scrape valleys wider than rivers. It reminds us of entropy again. Not chaos, not collapse, but the gradual shifting toward another form, another arrangement, another story scratched into stone. As we look at these landscapes today, fjords slicing into continents, basins cupping freshwater lakes, moraines tracing the edges of ancient advance, we see memory displayed in shape. The land itself holds history openly, though it masquerades as simple beauty. To stand in such places is to feel surrounded not merely by scenery, but by presence. One can almost hear the ice whisper its slow withdrawal, the groaning weight it left behind. Could it be that every mountain we see is not just a mountain, but a monument, altered always by frost, softened, broken, or carried piece by frozen flow? And when we trace these scars further, a humbling thought takes form. Glaciers remember more than oceans beneath glass. They remember how it felt to crush forests flat, how to bury fields and rivers alike until only silence remained. They remember carrying stones from one horizon to another, leaving them stranded as mute guardians in fields where no mountain ever stood. Geologists call them erratics, but they are also echoes, detached memories preserved in stone. They do not explain themselves, but they exist, reminding us that Earth's memory is long, and it does not erase easily, even when it seems it tries. We might ask ourselves, what do these valleys and grooves truly preserve? Are they more than marks of force? Or are they inscriptions of time itself? Reminders that the planet is never still, that its surfaces were both the script of fire and the calligraphy of ice? Perhaps what glaciers wrote most tenderly was not devastation, but continuity. That after silence, landscapes would find rivers again, forests again, breath again, though never in quite the same form. And maybe that is the gentle paradox at the heart of glacial motion. It is destruction, but it is also creation. A valley carved by ice becomes a home for rivers, for lakes, for fertile soils. A mountain ground down into dust becomes the sediment that plains grow upon. Perhaps beauty itself arises not in spite of the crushing silence, but because of it. The deep time of geology endlessly raises such wonder. Was there ever a mountain too eternal to be touched by ice? Or does all become softened eventually, given time? And what about us? If every mark of glacier is a memory preserved, then what of our own marks? Concrete cities, buried roads, altered rivers. Will they too become grooves, etched into the strata, sentences in Earth's greater book? Maybe glaciers remembered forests, and maybe one day glaciers will remember us. The rocks beneath our feet carry quiet honesty, never hurried, never exaggerating. They keep silence faithfully, holding scars open to anyone who chooses to look. But they never explain themselves fully, never declare their purpose. That much is left to us, to speculate, to dream, to piece together. And perhaps that lack of explanation is part of the gift, mystery enough to keep us listening. For if glaciers could transform continents simply by passing, then how much else in this world is written in motion we rarely feel? And if scars in stone hold such vivid silence, then what of the scars we cannot see, the ones pressed deeper beneath time, awaiting their chance to surface? And if glaciers could transform continents simply by passing, if their silence could carve valleys and scatter stones into new sentences, then what force could ever answer back to such weight? In those frozen ages, when nearly the whole world hushed under ice, the reply came not from wind, nor from oceans, but from fire rising deep within the planet. Volcanoes stirred, as they always do, but in those times their breath was not only destruction, it was salvation. Picture it quietly. Beneath the heavy lid of ice, pressure brewed in the mantle. Magma swelled in pockets. Gases dissolved within molten rock the way memory dissolves into silence, waiting to be released. And then, with patient inevitability, the fire rose. Volcanoes opened their throats, sending plumes into dim skies, and with that breath came carbon dioxide, spread through the atmosphere like an old warmth returning. It was as though the earth itself exhaled against its frozen skin, reminding itself that no silence could last forever. We think of eruptions as violent, but across deep time their rhythm changes. A single mountain can breathe for thousands of years, release after release, subtle yet relentless. Some eruptions white with ash, others dark with basalt flows, all of them adding to an invisible tally in the atmosphere. Each particle of ash that drifted back onto the ice was at once a weight and a possibility, darkening the albedo, storing slight warmth, hinting that beyond endless cold, there might be a way back to balance. The snow absorbed these fragments of fire and wore them like quiet specks of ink upon its pale expanse. Could it be that these tiny embers were seeds, written across the frozen canvas of a planet, preparing slowly for its thaw? And in those plumes we see memory, too. Trapped in volcanic glass, gases are sealed, little time capsules of ancient atmosphere that still whisper their composition today. Through these inclusions, geologists read the diary of eruptions long gone, measuring delicate isotopes, reconstructing the story of balance and imbalance. Carbon dioxide was not merely gas. It was a lever, a counterweight, the element that tilted the world from silence to voice. Without it, entropy might have continued its cold conquest. With it, warmth gradually returned. The paradox, of course, is that this lifeline was also threat. Too little volcanic breath, and ice would never have melted. Too much, and the warming could overwhelm. Earth has always walked this thin edge, never deliberate, always accidental, yet balanced enough that oceans thawed. How fragile that balance seems when we peer back and realize how easily this breath could have tipped another way. Is survival always such a coincidence in deep time? Or is there something within systems themselves that leans toward persistence, even if only by chance? Consider, too, the ash that drifted into oceans beneath the ice. Minerals dissolved into those hidden waters, feeding microbial life that waited patiently near vents. While the surface lay silent, life below was nourished by fire. Not because volcanoes intended it, not because there was direction, but because chemistry woven into the mantle reached out, offering energy where none else remained. Perhaps survival is less about resilience and more about accident. accidents repeated often enough that they appear inevitable. And maybe inevitability itself is only a story we tell to soothe the discomfort of chance. In this way, volcanoes became unwitting custodians of memory, the keepers of continuity amid suspension. Even ash, ground fine and layered into ice, became a record, a chronology waiting to be measured as dust trapped in glaciers that survived for millions of years. Each layer is like a page, thin yet enduring, reminding us that breath leaves a trace, always. And what of perception of time itself? To stand beneath such skies, under the quiet fall of ash snowing onto ice, would not feel hurried. It would feel endless, as though the sky itself had thickened into substance, darkening and brightening again across centuries. From our human vantage, eruptions are events. From the vantage of Earth, they are just another heartbeat. Breath in, breath out, magma swelling, gases rising, cycles unfolding. Perhaps the world's patience is the greatest mystery of all. The patience to let a frozen age last millions of years, and the patience to end it by increments no one could see in the moment. And as we imagine this exchange between ice and fire, between silence and breath, we come close to an existential recognition. That Earth itself is not static, not secure, not even alive in ways we recognize, and yet it behaves as though it remembers to breathe, as though the act of continuation is written in its very body. Maybe the planet itself holds memory not as thought, but as cycles, freeze and thaw, eruption and stillness, silence and renewal. What if, in the secret arithmetic of deep time, volcanoes are less destroyers than restorers? What if their eruptions, terrifying to imagine, are part of what ensures continuity at scales beyond us? It is an unsettling comfort to imagine fire as guardian, to imagine the ground itself as sighing in relief against the weight of ice. Volcanoes, in their endless patience, remind us that nothing is one thing only. Fire can devastate or preserve. Ice can erase or protect. Silence itself can smother, yet also cradle what might last. The planet's story is written in these paradoxes, and we, quiet listeners in the present, lean close to decipher them, even if what we decode is partial, incomplete, fragile. And as fire met ice in those distant ages, as plumes stitched warmth into the pale sky, the world began to dream of its thaw. Slowly, glaciers loosened their grip, landscapes remembered rivers, valleys were itemized once more in liquid motion. Life stretched outward from the shadows, tentative, willing, ready. Yet the question lingers, soft as ash drifting from a darkened sky. Was this return guaranteed? Or was it only temporary? Another momentary breath before cold gathered again? And as fire met ice in those distant ages, as plumes rose like breath against a frozen sky, the world began to deposit its memories in matter. Volcanoes exhaled carbon, glaciers answered with silence, and together they left an inheritance not of words, not of parchment, but of stone. If the ice sculpted continents and fire restored warmth, then the stones became language. They became the medium through which Earth began to keep its diary, so that long after the glaciers retreated, and long after the fires dimmed, we might one day lean close and listen. Isotopes live within this language, subtle variations of the same element, like letters rearranged in countless possible ways. Oxygen, in particular, remembers the climate. Part of its family sits heavier, less eager to evaporate, more willing to settle back into ice or ocean. Part of it drifts lighter, more easily drawn into the sky, a breath captured in a cloud. By tracing the ratios of these kinds of oxygen in minerals, we begin to hear the pulse of ancient Earth. Freeze, thaw, freeze again. The isotopes repeat the record like a heartbeat stretching back into epochs beyond imagination. To a casual eye, a chunk of limestone or quartz may appear nothing more than silence frozen into matter. Yet within its lattice, the isotopes are aligned like music awaiting an instrument. Scientists measure them with careful hands, and suddenly, the silence speaks. Ratios swing toward cold, then drift toward warmth, like tides written not in water, but in chemistry. What results is nothing short of astonishing. A climate diary woven into every molecule, too small to see, yet faithful enough to carry deep time without distortion. It is worth pausing here to feel the humility of it. Our own human histories vanish so easily. Papyri crumble, ink fades, voices are lost into air. But in stone, time leaves clocks we can still read billions of years later. And perhaps that is why geology often feels less like science and more like translation. These isotopic patterns are not written for us, nor with intention, but when we measure them, we bridge silence. We ask questions of matter, and matter, in its quiet honesty, gives an answer more ancient than language itself. And yet, even in this clarity, there is mystery. We can see the signs of cooling and warming, but we cannot always know the precise why. Was it volcanoes again, exhaling warmth? Was it continents drifting into polar night, or oceans redistributing their currents? Maybe it was all of these, overlapping, folding into one another. The isotopes record the rhythm but not the cause, the music but not the composer. And in that gap, wonder expands. Could it be that memory itself is always partial, like fragments of a dream remembered at dawn? Perhaps this is what makes the language of stones so compelling. It does not reveal everything at once. It draws us deeper. Every layer of snow compacted into ice, every coral skeleton hardened into rock, every shell left behind in limestone. All of them store their message in isotopes that quietly count what we cannot see. To hold one in your hand is to carry time itself, disguised as ordinary weight. And so the planet keeps speaking whether we listen or not. Cores drilled from glaciers record the breath of the atmosphere. Sediments crushed deep in the ocean hold fossil plankton, whose shells encode temperatures of seas long gone. Even meteorites, arriving from planetary formation, hold isotopic ratios that speak of conditions predating Earth itself. What if stones are not only Earth's memory, but the universe's first diary, an ongoing record without a reader until now? When we listen to these clocks, we discover that Earth is never still. There is no true constancy, only cycles and pauses. Warmth accumulates, cold advances, always shifting, always balancing along a thin threshold. Maybe there is no final destination, no permanent climate, no eternal state. Only rhythm, only beats, only the echoing balance of isotopes marking time. And perhaps that puzzle holds an echo for us as well. Our own memories, fragile and shifting, are never complete. We retain fragments, we forget others, we try desperately to preserve in writing or image, knowing we cannot save it all. Yet in some quiet way, the Earth does for itself what we attempt. It leaves a code, unintentional but lasting. A memory in chemistry, a diary in stone, an archive we stumble toward, centuries after the events are gone, asking questions not unlike what we ask of our own personal past. What really happened here? Who endured? What was lost? But we cannot know everything. The isotopes are faithful, yet they cannot restore vanished voices, cannot revive erased species, cannot unbury civilizations if such things ever came before us. They preserve conditions, not stories. They count, but they do not imagine. And so the silence remains, giving us truth but leaving us mystery. Maybe that balance itself is important, because it forces us to continue wondering, to continue searching. So we trace the fingerprints of oxygen, of carbon, of strontium and lead, each ratio another phrase in Earth's unending script. And as we listen, we begin to hear a strange reflecting thought. If even atoms can keep a diary, then perhaps memory is a natural law of the universe itself. Maybe to exist is to remember in some form, whether as isotope or fossil, as stone or mind. And if that is true, then nothing, not even silence, is truly without trace. And yet, even with such faith in chemistry, even with these remarkable clocks written into stone, we remain unsettled by one lingering question. If the planet remembers so much through its elements, then what has it chosen not to remember at all? And yet, even with isotopes keeping their calm and meticulous diaries, even with stones carrying the chemical pulse of ancient climates, there is a different kind of record we long for. Not records of air or chemistry alone, but of living beings themselves. We wish to know who was there, what forms of life braved the ice, how they endured or how they disappeared. And here the record falters. Here, the world falls into silence. Fossils from the frozen ages are rare, faint, fragmented almost to nothing. They are like half-swallowed voices caught in wind, whispers that trail off before we can hear the end. Layers of rock that should have preserved entire communities often show only absence. Not because nothing lived, but because survival was pressed into shadows where fossils rarely form. Life withdrew into places where pressure and chemistry favored continuation, but not memory. And so the story of these ages is a record of erasure. We stand in front of this silence and wonder, what becomes of life trapped beneath storms of ice and snow, unable to leave a trace for the future? Could there have been entire ecosystems hidden under frozen seas, existing for thousands of years, leaving no fossils, only absence? Could there have been lineages of creatures we will never know, extinguished not only in existence but in memory itself? It is an unsettling question, and yet, in a strange way, comforting too, because even the faintest fragments that survive carry an immensity of meaning. A single stromatolite dome weathered into subtle curves tells us that life endured. A foraminifera shell sealed in ocean sediments reminds us that survival was possible, even at the edge of erasure. Deep time has always been harsher on life than on stone. Rocks survive being buried, folded, melted, even recycled in the jaws of subduction zones before cooling once more into solidity. But organisms are fragile, delicate, easily crushed, easily dissolved into silence. Entropy presses heavier on life than it does on granite or basalt. And so living memory is often the first to vanish, leaving us to reconstruct whole ages from the smallest of remnants. Maybe this is why fossils feel more intimate than isotopes, because they are not only records of climate but echoes of presence, of identity, of lives once unfolding under skies we will never know. When you hold a fossil from these frozen epochs, it does not speak clearly. Its shape is distorted, its structure faint. But perhaps that is why it feels so profound. It is broken, but it persists. It is incomplete, but it endured across millions of years. We might say its silence is louder than most voices, because it calls attention to all we do not know. It reminds us how much the earth forgets, how much it hides, how rarely it preserves. Not because it chooses, but because preservation itself is a fragile accident. Fossilization requires chance, the right chemistry, the right pressure, the right shelter. Without these, life simply dissolves back into minerals, leaving the world as though it had never been. And yet, the very few fossils we do find in these icy layers prove that something endured. Microbial mats clung to the shelter of volcanic vents. Tiny plankton adapted to the dimmest of conditions, turning even the faintest light or nutrient into survival. Life did not explode in abundance, but it persisted quietly, patiently, almost invisibly. This is survival at its edge, at the limit between remembrance and forgetting. Could it be that life's greatest strength is not growth, but persistence? Could it be that the deepest lesson of fossils is this: memory can fade, identity can fracture, but endurance, even at the faintest edge, is enough to carry story forward? Each fossil, even when broken, is a window glimpsing into an entire world otherwise erased. A single shell points toward oceans that swelled and retreated. A single microbial trace hints at chemistries circulating beneath miles of ice. Each one is not just a remnant, but a bridge to all that no longer exists. And so, as we stare into the faintness of the fossil record, we don't only mourn its gaps, we feel awe that anything remains at all. Perhaps absence itself is part of the memory. Perhaps the silence in fossils is not entirely lack, but a record in its own right. The absence tells us that ice consumes, that snow buries, that oceans freeze and erase. Absence tells us what environments refuse to preserve, what shadows were too deep for record-keeping. Couldn't we see absence too as inscription, silence as writing? Maybe the earth speaks equally in marks and in erasures. As we drift into this thought, we find ourselves asking what our own traces will look like in the fossil record millions of years from now. Will human fossils endure, or will they dissolve into untraceable fragments? Will our world leave silence, or will technofossils carry echoes of us into far epochs? And if only silence of us remains, does that mean we were forgotten? Or does the silence itself become proof we once were? Life during the frozen ages pressed itself against erasure, leaving only slivers of testimony. And those slivers call us closer to listen, not to what is said, but to what is missing. That missing voice becomes its own haunting presence. It asks us to notice not what is preserved, but what was lost, what slipped completely beyond reach. And yet, in that vast gap in memory, we feel the shape of something larger. Something carried not in fossils alone, but in landscapes, in isotopes, in oceans, in valleys. The fossils are faint, but Earth itself remembers in other ways. Could it be that the planet's memory is always distributed, always shared by chemistry, stone, ice, atmosphere, and life alike? Perhaps fossils are only one chapter in an unfinished book, their silence a bridge toward another kind of record, written as invisibly as air itself. And so we lean toward that next memory, the one captured not in bones, not in shells, but in the greater question of the planet itself. Fossils fell silent in those frozen centuries, leaving only faint fragments, and in their silence they passed the question forward. Did it happen as we imagine? Did Earth truly freeze from pole to pole, its oceans buried beneath miles of glass, its continents cloaked in a single, seamless shell of ice, so complete that no world of blue or green existed at all? The idea is called Snowball Earth, and it lingers like frost at the edge of our imagination. A theory so haunting it feels like myth, but one rooted in stone. Evidence gathers quietly, scattered through geology like fragments of a poem. We see glacial deposits resting near what should have been the tropics, striations in rocks that now lie at the equator, telling us ice once ground itself across these places. Carbon isotopes slide into strange anomalies, massive deviations that whisper of a biosphere under siege. There are layers of cap carbonate, thick deposits spread above ancient glacial rock, suggesting sudden melt, an Earth that swung from stillness into flood in the blink of geological time. These are the marks left in stone, signals we can measure, and yet they do not speak in unison. Some say they prove an entire planet wrapped in white. Others tell us they reveal something less complete. An Earth that shivered, but not sealed. An Earth with bands of open water under frozen belts. A slush ball rather than a snowball. The difference may seem slight, but it carries weight. If the Earth was a full snowball, locked completely in ice, life itself would have been pressed to its limit, hidden in volcanic vents, in tiny sanctuaries far below the surface. If it was only a slush ball, then perhaps there were fragile refuges of open sea, strips of ocean glimmering like veins of dark against the pale planet. The fossils we lack cannot tell us which vision is true, and so the silence endures, silence that is as much mystery as it is memory. Perhaps most haunting is the sheer scale of such a freeze if it did occur. Imagine Earth from orbit, not the familiar swirl of blue and green and cloud, but a white sphere hanging in blackness, a world of endless reflection. Sunlight bounces back into space. Heat is repelled. Energy escapes into emptiness faster than it can be caught. Entropy, on the scale of a planet, becomes a gleaming mirror of stillness. Could it be that this very image was real, that the Earth once dressed itself entirely in silence as if testing the limits of survival? Or is the image itself an illusion, built from evidence stretched across gaps of uncertainty? Science does not answer easily here, because geology is a patient and imperfect archivist. Rocks preserve scars but not intentions. Isotopes record rhythms but not melodies. Without fuller context, we hold fragments and are asked to wonder what pattern they belong to. And in that wondering, science becomes philosophical. To study Snowball Earth is to sit inside uncertainty, to accept that our planet's deepest histories are not always written with clarity. Perhaps this is where speculation becomes not weakness, but strength, because speculation keeps the question open, keeps the story alive. And maybe that is the important truth, that sometimes mystery is as much a teacher as evidence. If the Earth was a snowball, then silence is the teacher. If it was a slush ball, then fragility is the lesson. In both, survival was forced to its limit. In both, memory became fractured and faint. And in both, the planet itself endured, carrying forward life in forms humble and unseen, until warmth returned. The idea of a snowball Earth also expands into something greater, presses us to imagine identity. What would it mean to be lost in such completeness? A planet locked white, hiding its oceans, muffling its forests before they could even arise. Would such a world even remember itself the same way? Perhaps identity exists not only for life, but for planets too. Was Earth, then, still Earth when blue and green vanished? Or was it something else? Worlds beyond our own bring these questions closer. Astronomers study exoplanets frozen at their poles, planets locked to suns with one face in light, one in darkness. Some appear caught forever in cold. When we think of snowball Earth, we also think of them as if our own planet, billions of years ago, rehearsed conditions that might exist elsewhere now. Could ours be a local story, or is it part of a universal pattern? Could it be that memory itself is planetary, repeating in world after world, each sphere of rock and water testing extremes of heat and cold, silence and storm? And what about us, our perception, our sense of time? To us, an ice age feels catastrophic, but in deep time, even a full snowball is still a single chapter, written and erased across billions of years. To hold that understanding is to realize how brief our own chapter is. What we name certainty may only be pause. What we imagine as permanence may only be rhythm. The planet has frozen and thawed, and may freeze again, each time carrying within it not just geology, but the fragile persistence of life tested against near erasure. So the tension remains. Was Earth fully locked or partly open? Was it dressed in silent completeness or fractured by streaks of survival? The rocks invite us to lean closer, but each time we do, we notice both clarity and ambiguity. Clear markers of ice where no ice should belong, but also room for doubt. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps the Earth itself allows the mystery to remain. Like a secret it refuses to speak fully, even as it leaves enough for us to wonder. And that wonder is where the question truly lives, not in the finality of an answer, but in the living tension between possibility and silence. Because what if the Earth did freeze? What if survival brushed against its edge and nearly failed? Then every life today exists because of the narrowest thread of endurance. And yet, if it did not happen in that way, if warmth always lingered somewhere, then what we see now is also the product of refuge, of partial shelter, of survival in flickering pockets of light. Whichever is true, the lesson does not change. Existence is fragile and memory is uneven, no matter where we turn. So we leave the Earth hovering between two imaginaries, snowball or slushball, fact or fractured story. And as silence in the fossil record hands its question to this icy debate, so too does this debate hand forward another. If the planet can hold such extremes, if it can fold itself into silence and return, then what does that say about entropy, about memory, about the inevitability of change? Could it be that every thaw carries within it the seed of the next freeze, and every freeze the seed of the next thaw? And so, from the silence of a possible snowball Earth, we move gently into another presence that lies hidden beneath the idea of ice. Because even if the world was locked in stillness, even if oceans froze and winds hushed to whispers, the story of change did not vanish. Entropy does not rest. It never has, and it never will. In the frozen ages of Earth, when time itself seemed to hesitate, entropy became tangible. Not loud, not visible, but felt as weight, as pause, as work too slow for the eye to measure. In the hush of frozen centuries, rocks still fractured, but they did so more slowly than before. Frost crept into tiny veins of stone, water expanding as it froze, prying mineral away from mineral, shift by shift across centuries. Where rivers once carried silt and voice, they paused under ice, but pause does not mean ending. Below the frozen crust, currents still worked in silence, moving cold molecules from place to place, following the quiet mathematics of balance. Even when covered in stillness, systems refused to be truly still. Entropy, after all, is not chaos, but change. It is the law that energy spreads if left alone, that gradients blur across time. In the cold, this truth lingered like breath on glass. Heat seeped slowly from Earth's core toward the surface, dispersing little by little into the starless air above. Life, even its smallest forms, felt this pull toward balance, this gradual wearing down of edges. Cells decayed, not dramatically, but inevitably. Long chains of chemistry slipped into dissolution. Whole patterns of existence softened toward equilibrium. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but given enough time, everything pressed toward diffusion. Ice did not stop this, it only muted it, lowering the tempo to an almost imperceptible rhythm. If you had been able to stand in such an age, to look around at mountains buried in white silence, at oceans sealed and frozen tight, you might have thought nothing was moving at all. But you would have been wrong. You would not have seen the atoms vibrating, the bonds breaking, the minerals recrystallizing. You would not have noticed how the weight of glaciers pressed continents deeper into their mantle roots, pushing and bending the land, only for them to rise again when the ice retreated. You would not have heard the invisible whispers of isotopes resetting themselves, carrying within their ratios the quiet imprint of temperature shifts unfolding across millennia. The illusion was of stillness, but the truth was always motion beneath the hush. And perhaps this is why entropy in the cold feels both haunting and humbling. Because silence, we learn, does not mean absence. Silence often means something subtler, something hidden. The world can appear motionless while endless work continues in its shadows. How much of existence is like this for us too? Outwardly quiet, inwardly alive with imperceptible motion. How often do we mistake stillness for nothingness, when all along a truth is unfolding, slow, enduring, invisible? The cold exaggerated this, revealing entropy in its faintest costume. The slower decay, the quieter fracture, the longer pause between shifts showed us the long patience of the universe. Maybe stasis is an illusion we project onto processes slower than we can count. Maybe what seems static is only time unfolding at intervals too vast for us to comprehend. As we imagine those frozen centuries, we breathe into the larger question of memory itself. If entropy works everywhere, in hot and cold, in silence and in fire, then perhaps memory too is a product of entropy, a residue of what resists its pull, traces left behind as energy spreads. Stones fracture and hold their scars. Isotopes shift and leave their ratios. Valleys open and mark the wander of glaciers. Even fossils, faint in the cold, can be seen as entropy's traces, the remains left standing at the edge of dissolution. Could it be that memory itself is nothing more than the fragments entropy allows to linger? Not all was erased, not all was undone. In the cold, patterns of snow repeated across centuries, crystals shaping themselves by laws older than the planet itself. Those shapes too are entropy's work, the arrangement of disorder into momentary geometry before dispersing again into melt. Silence reveals, if we listen carefully enough, that nothing is permanent, but nothing is ever truly gone either. Energy remains, motion continues, transformation is endless, and this reflection leaves the lingering thought. If entropy works so quietly in the silence of ice, pressing its patient hand across every stone, every ocean, every cell, then how might it be shaping us even now? Could our own identities be fragments along this greater law, held for a moment before dissolving into something else, remembered only in traces we cannot imagine? And so, even in the stillest ages, entropy carried on its hidden work, reminding us that the cold does not freeze time, it only slows its unfolding, which means the silence of ice was never just silence, but another kind of record waiting. And if silence itself can be memory, then perhaps what returns from it next is not only warmth, but echoes. Echoes carried forward, waiting to be heard in layers of stone. And if silence itself can be memory, then what returns from it next is not only warmth, but echoes. Echoes sewn into the layers of stone, faint vibrations that do not vanish but bend and scatter, waiting to return across the vastness of time. Every advance of ice, every retreat, every hesitation pressed its shape into sediment, into grains settling on the ocean floor, into mud that hardened into rock, into layers now buried miles deep. These are echoes in deep time, not heard by the ear but read with the patience of hands, of tools, of minds willing to listen differently. To imagine an echo in geologic time is to shift perspective. In a cave, You may shout and hear yourself return, distorted, delayed, but familiar. In Earth's crust, the echo arrives not in seconds but in billions of years. A glacier advances, grinding dust, and that dust falls into the sea. Compacts, it buries, it turns to stone. Ages later, long after the glacier and the silence are gone, we unearth it, measure its chemistry, and in that measurement, we hear the whisper repeated back to us. The voice that once belonged to an ice age lives again, not in clarity, but as impression, as resonance. Sediments hold these voices imperfectly, and perhaps that imperfection is part of their beauty. They bend signals, scatter them, fold them under pressure and heat, as if to say that memory is never returned in its original form. Look closely at clay layers, and you will find dust rich in iron, blown into oceans when continents froze and dried. Peer into ancient banded strata, and you may find the alternating quiet of calm seas and sudden pulsations of meltwater floods. Each one says something. Each one echoes a moment otherwise lost. And still, each echo carries distortion, gaps, absences. Time never lets a message return unchanged. And isn't that true for us, too? Our own memories, like those sediment records, return altered. We do not remember events so much as the echoes of them, bent by the years that fall between. We carry fragments, not wholes. And yet, those fragments are enough to remind us we once lived, we once felt, we once endured. Could it be that memory itself, whether human or planetary, is always a kind of echo? Never complete, never exact, but still worthy of listening? Geology invites us to lean close and trace these faint vibrations back into forgotten epochs. Tiny microfossils, invisible to the naked eye, accumulate in layers upon layers, their very chemical makeup registering the temperature of oceans long gone. Traces of isotopes, subtle and balanced in mathematically precise ratios, reveal the breadth of atmospheres that have disappeared. Each is an echo, each is delayed, but together they assemble a kind of chorus that allows us to imagine climates we never saw, worlds we never lived in, but that once sustained life precariously at the edge of silence. Perhaps what is most humbling is that these echoes never stop. Every year, rivers carry silt into the sea, layers fall, memory is buried. Right now, below us, new echoes are being written, sentences that will not return until millions of years forward. When we think of deep time, it is tempting to imagine only the past. But the sediment beneath our oceans is also memory laid down for the future, waiting for another intelligence to uncover, to interpret, to wonder about in turn. Echoes traveling not backward but forward, making us participants in a cosmic cycle of remembrance. And what of the distortion, the scattering? What seems at first like error may be its own kind of truth. An echo that bends differently may reveal something about the place it traveled through, about the cave, about the stone, about the structure it bounced from. Likewise, a record in sediments that appears fractured may reveal precisely how time pressed, folded, or melted it. Distortion is not the loss of signal but the reshaping of it, a reminder that all messages pass through entropy, and in doing so, gain new meaning. So as we read these echoes, we are asked to sit not only with what they tell us but with what they blur. The silences, the absences, the gaps between signals, these too are part of memory. They remind us of the time unrecorded, the lives undocumented, the worlds that vanished without leaving a trace. Absence is also sound. Silence is also voice. Maybe the question is not whether we hear everything clearly, but whether we are quiet enough to hear it all. And so, in the slow resonance of rocks, in the echoes rising from sediments crushed over billions of years, we can close our eyes and feel a continuity stronger than clarity. Ice crushed, melted, returned, and each time it spoke in its own way, not in sentences but in repetitions, not in detail but in rhythm. Like a chorus without words, deep time carries voices back to us. And though we will never hear the full songs, the fragments are enough to confirm that silence was never empty, which leaves us to wonder. If echoes always return, in stone, in memory, in sound, then what echoes of us will remain, bent and scattered, millions of years from now? What faint vibration of our age will some future intelligence hear? And what silences will they mistake for absence? And yet, if even silence comes back in resonance, if even absence reveals its own texture over time, then perhaps nothing we experience is ever truly gone. Perhaps everything leaves behind at least an echo. And as those echoes layer themselves over one another, pressed deeper into stone, they invite us toward the next truth, that time does not only echo backward, it carries its reverberations forward into every melt, every thaw, every return. And if echoes always return, scattered through stone, resonating through sediments and isotopes, then perhaps the greatest echo of all was not the silence of ice, but the soundless return of water. Because no freeze in Earth's history has lasted forever, and in time even the most patient ice begins to loosen, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow insistence of warmth pressing at its edges. Eventually, warmth fought back. It gathered drop by drop, whisper by whisper, until the world, still clutching memory of its stillness, began to soften into motion again. To imagine the long melting is to imagine a planet not waking quickly but stirring slowly, like a sleeper reluctant to rise. The first meltwater trickled in silence, perhaps unnoticed beneath miles of frozen weight, but it carried the promise of change. Beneath the ice, pressure carved channels, and water threaded its way along hidden cracks. Pools formed where no pools had been for millions of years. Drops grew into trickles, trickles into rivulets, rivulets into torrents. Yet still, the thaw was not sudden. Melting worlds do not awaken at once, they remember slowly. They ease their way out of silence, testing the contours of motion, reshaping rivers and soils with unhurried force. In that stretching of time, geology was rewritten. Valleys that had been sealed in ice opened again. Rivers rediscovered their paths, or carved new ones entirely, guided by memory and chance in equal measure. Floods, sudden and immense, roared across lands as entire lakes trapped within ice broke free at once, sculpting landscapes in days that would appear, millions of years later, as the work of eons. What seems gradual when written through millennia could, in moments, break into chaos. And so the thaw was both gentle and violent, a duality of patience and eruption, a reminder that even release carries contradictions. The air changed too. Carbon dioxide, breathed out by volcanoes through the frozen silence, thickened the atmosphere. Methane once locked inside ice sheets seeped outward, magnifying the warmth. With each release, feedback loops awoke. Melting revealed darker surfaces beneath, rock and sea that absorbed more light than reflective ice, compounding the thaw. Earth remembered warmth, and memory became momentum. Could it be that the world never truly forgets its climates, but carries their pattern, ready to repeat when conditions align? Life answered this slow resurgence with equal slowness, unfolding cautiously from its shadows. Microbes that had survived in vents and subglacial refuges spread outward into seas uncovered again. Cyanobacteria bloomed, throwing oxygen back into the atmosphere, reinforcing the planetary breath that would one day make complex life possible. In their flickering expansion is a lesson, too. Survival is never about immediate flourishing. It is about holding out long enough, waiting for the world's rhythm to shift, enduring until the long silence begins to melt. And still, vast uncertainties remain. Where exactly did life persist during those frozen ages? In pockets beneath ice, near the heat of hydrothermal vents, within salty brines that refuse to freeze entirely? We cannot know for certain, only trace their faint echoes in chemistry, in isotopes sealed into carbonate rocks. And yet, these uncertainties pull us closer, reminding us that mystery itself is part of memory. That what life was, what it endured, is perhaps less important than the simple fact that it endured at all. The long melting did not simply release water. It released memory into landscapes. Rocks bore the scars of glacial retreat. Soils spread from ground once compressed. Basins filled with the remnants of meltwater floods. This reshaping was more than physical. It was existential. Each carved valley, each smoothed granite face, each abandoned boulder became a record of thaw. They are the evidence that time itself can undo silence, given patience. We might wonder, How did the Earth feel in those first warmer centuries? Was there a sense of relief, or of imbalance, or perhaps simply inevitability? The planet does not choose, but it responds. Physics unfolds, chemistry balances, entropy takes its course. Yet in that unfolding we read metaphors for ourselves. We too emerge from silences slowly. We too carry scars of what froze us. And we too step back into motion not all at once, but with halting drops that grow into rivers. Perhaps the long melting is not just planetary. It is personal, a mirror for all forms that wait for warmth to return before unfolding themselves again. And as warmth spread, as oceans loosened their glassy lids, the Earth rediscovered currents, rediscovered cycles of evaporation and rain. The hydrological cycle breathed once more, carrying water from sea to sky to land. Clouds thickened, storms gathered, rivers stretched like veins across the continents. The frozen world reanimated, and though much had been lost, something profound was gained. A rebalancing, a continuation, a chance for the story to move forward again. But we must remember this was not final. The melting did not promise everlasting warmth. It was another chapter in a repeating rhythm, another turn in a cycle of ice and thaw, entropy and order, silence and sound. Could it be that we mistake these interludes of livable climate for permanence, when they are only pauses between greater extremes? Could it be that our own age is not stability but interval, fragile and brief? The long melting was salvation only in hindsight, and perhaps even now it remains unfinished. For memory of cold always lingers, folded into the planet's chemistry, waiting. Ice does not vanish. It retreats, it gathers itself elsewhere, it keeps watch at the horizons. Every thaw carries within it the potential of the next freeze. Every silence leaves echoes that prepare the world for another cycle. And so, as the glaciers pulled back, as rivers reawakened and soils softened, the Earth carried its scars forward, leaving us to ask, if even silence can be reshaped into motion, then what very old wisdom lives hidden in the landscapes around us, waiting not just to be studied, but to be felt? And so, as glaciers loosened their grip and rivers began to remember their paths once more, the world entered intervals that felt like reprieves. Pauses between silences, fragile windows when warmth lingered long enough for life to breathe outward again. These were not eternal summers, not secure climates, but fleeting seasons of possibility, intermissions between frozen chapters. And in those intervals, ecosystems bloomed briefly and delicately, building networks of life that might vanish again with the return of cold. They were forgotten ecosystems, not because they held less meaning, but because time remembered them only faintly, scattered in fragments left behind. Imagine a shoreline of that distant Earth, warmed after long centuries of quiet. Cyanobacteria spread once more, covering tidal flats in subtle harnessings of light. They painted the air again with oxygen, small but steady breaths that altered atmosphere and ocean alike. Coral-like organisms, humble pioneers of skeletal shelter, grew in shallow waters, weaving reefs delicate by our standards but monumental in the context of such a fragile recovery. Foraminifera shed their intricate shells, marking waters with the chemistry of their time. Chains of plankton drifted across seas no longer bound in ice, feeding a food web that whispered toward complexity. These were seasons when possibility turned itself briefly into presence. And yet they never lasted long. The Earth quivered on the edge of instability, always flirting with another freeze. Life expanded cautiously, as if it knew the warmth was temporary, as if endurance meant learning to thrive quickly before vanishing again. Fossil layers from these in-between ages tell of bursts of biodiversity pressed thin between long silences. They are not consistent, but they are passionate, small waves of life echoing across intervals, announcing that possibility never fully died, even if memory almost erased it. Could it be that fragility itself is fertile, that fleeting opportunity encourages faster innovation, forcing organisms to experiment with form and chemistry in compressed seasons of survival? Perhaps cycles of freezing and blooming were not just trials, but engines of creativity. Whenever the ice retreated, ecosystems raced to cover the naked world again with life, filling niches, weaving balance, constructing miniature Edens, all under the shadow that they would soon be dismantled once more. Maybe we think of stability as necessary, but maybe it is instability, repetition of loss and return, that shapes deep evolution. Geologically, this pattern is visible in the cap carbonates that followed major glaciations. Thick, unusual layers of carbonate rock, precipitated in warm seas fed by an outpouring of carbon dioxide released during thaw. Within these carbonates hide fossils, tiny skeletal organisms that made use of sudden abundance. They speak to blooms of productivity, bursts of photosynthesis, wild transformations of chemistry. And though they survived only briefly, they changed the world. They adjusted the atmosphere, they altered seawater composition, they left traces we still read now in the language of stone. Isn't it extraordinary how small, fragile organisms could alter the fabric of the planet itself, imprinting memory onto entire oceans? But just as quickly as they grew, many disappeared. Cycles of ice returned, glaciers pulled forward again, and life retreated back into vents, into shadows, into its ancient silence. Entire ecosystems painted onto the canvas of warmth were wiped clean. Not because they were weak, but because the canvas itself was taken away. The Earth did not ask them to vanish. It simply withdrew the conditions required for their story. And yet, fragments remained. Microscopic fossils pressed into sediments, mineral films layered over ancient shells. Fragments that waited for billions of years for us to lean close, to notice, to imagine the worlds they represented. What we call forgotten ecosystems are perhaps not forgotten at all, but remembered differently, remembered imperfectly. They lived in spans too short for permanence, but their echoes altered what followed. The oxygen they released supported the next cycles of endurance. The minerals they rearranged seeded the chemistry of later life. And though erased from sight, they continued forward as influence, as subtle background, invisible threads connecting one thaw to the next. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson, that nothing is wasted. Even the briefest bloom leaves traces, reshaping what comes after. When we reflect on these intervals of warmth, we find ourselves asking what it means to be brief. Is brevity fragility, or does it carry its own kind of strength? If entire ecosystems can rise, flourish, and vanish without leaving clarity in the fossil record, does that mean they mattered less? Or does it mean their true role was to prepare foundations unseen? We might ask the same of ourselves. How much of what we build remains? How much dissolves into sediment, remembered only as faint chemistry in a future we cannot predict? Maybe, maybe not. The thought drifts like a tide, repetitive, unresolved, and in that repetition becomes hypnotic. And as warmth held, even if only for a time, soils formed again where glaciers withdrew. Rivers carried sediments, forests of microbial mats rebounded, and photosynthesis painted the air with breath. To walk in such a recovering world would have been to walk among survivors, organisms both fragile and powerful, each one part of an ecosystem destined to collapse and return, collapse and return. There must have been an atmosphere of impermanence, not unlike sandcastles built and restored by endless tides. But perhaps that impermanence is itself the essence of nature, the refusal of any moment to last forever, yet the insistence that something always returns. We stand now at a distance of over 500 million years from these forgotten worlds. We gaze back through fragments of fossilized shells, mineral layers, isotopic patterns carried through stone. And what we see is not fullness but suggestion, not clarity but shadow. Still, the shadows are enough to awaken wonder in us. That Earth has carried so many hidden ecosystems, painted briefly, erased quickly, but never lost entirely. Their memory lingers in chemistry, in oxygen, in stone, in us. And yet, if whole ecosystems can bloom and vanish in the spaces between silences, leaving only the faintest trace behind, then what else might the Earth have carried that we will never know? What entire worlds may have risen and passed without leaving even these fragile echoes? And yet, if whole ecosystems could vanish in the space between silences, leaving behind only faint traces of their brief existence, then we are reminded that history itself can be shifted not only by continents or oceans, not only by glaciers or volcanoes, but by the smallest of things. For in the quiet ages of ice, when deserts breathed their grains into the air, dust became a painter. Winds carried fine particles and laid them gently across the vast whiteness of glaciers, a soft veil against the purity of ice. And in that veil, the planet's destiny was altered. Imagine such dust falling, each grain almost weightless, rising first into the atmosphere as part of storms somewhere far away, carried for thousands of miles until settling on frozen seas or mountain ice. Alone, a single particle means nothing, but together, across centuries, they built a subtle overlay of pigment on the glacier's blinding white. What followed was a transformation in light itself. The pristine surface of ice reflects, always sending sunlight back into space. But dust darkens. Dust absorbs just a little more energy, a little more heat. This meant warmth clung longer, melt began sooner. And so, the tiniest grains participated in thaw. Could it be that the balance between frozen worlds and living ones hinged on something as frail as dust scattered across their faces? Geology shows us the evidence, buried in ice cores dug from the heart of ancient glaciers. Within them, trapped dust remains, a careful record of aridity elsewhere, of winds once stronger, of deserts once sprawling. Scientists read its chemistry, tracing it back to continents long shifted and oceans long gone. In these grains live clues to Earth's atmosphere, to cycles of dryness and storm, to distant places that fed the glaciers without ever touching them directly. Dust is connective tissue, linking deserts to ice, winds to oceans, entropy to memory. Perhaps it is in connections, rather than singular forces, that destiny unfolds. And the process extended beyond light and warmth. Dust also carries nutrients, iron, phosphorus, trace elements, that fertilized oceans when snow carried them down into meltwater flows. Even in the coldest times, life beneath the ice may have bloomed anew in small surges when dust delivered what the sea required. Imagine, a bloom emerging not because the world was generous, but because storms carried fragments of eroded land into the silence of frozen seas. Life, therefore, was tied not only to heat but to the scattering of minerals born on the breath of air. What makes dust extraordinary is not its weight, but its burden of possibility. We think of great forces, volcanoes, glaciers, tectonics, as the true sculptors of time. And yet, here is dust, master of subtlety, altering the energy balance of the planet, providing nourishment at the edge of survival, able to tip climates delicately one way or another. Could it be that history's turning points are less about grand gestures and more about accumulation? That entire climates are shifted not by singular events, but by the endless layering of small grains, millions upon millions, falling without witness into silence? Even today we can see echoes of this past roll of dust. Iron blown from the Sahara fertilizes the Amazon. Ash from volcanoes enriches plankton blooms. Deserts and life are linked in ways that feel paradoxical. Barrenness feeding abundance, emptiness sustaining continuation. Entropy, again, disguising itself as generosity. Maybe survival is always tied to strange companions, forces that appear destructive but conceal nourishment within their decay. And dust, more than most forces, calls us into reflection on memory. For dust both erases and preserves. It buries landscapes, conceals features, and in doing so, protects them. Bones can lie intact beneath layers of dust for thousands of years, fossilizing slowly under its weight. Artifacts of civilizations, too, have been hidden under drifting sands, preserved by absence. Dust is both silence and echo, eraser and archivist. The duality it represents belongs not just to climate, but to memory itself, frailty that also safeguards, destruction that also preserves. Perhaps this is why the image of dust on ice feels so powerful. It is not dramatic, not violent. It is patient, almost invisible, but in deep time it changes everything. Maybe the most fragile forces are the most transformative. A glacier moves mountains, but dust shifts climates. A single grain rests unnoticed, but collectively, they write the turning points of worlds. Could the same be said for us, that it is not our monumental acts, but our smallest, repeated traces that leave enduring mark? not because they are loud, but because they are persistent. And so, as the winds carried pigments of desert across the face of ancient glaciers, the ice responded in kind, adjusting its albedo, absorbing its warmth, reshaping its destiny line by line. Dust became not merely a passenger of the atmosphere, but an author in the planet's diary. Perhaps we are still reading its words, grains scattered across ages, faint but insistent, telling us softly that nothing is too small to matter. And yet, if even the tiniest particles could tip the balance of ice and warmth, altering oceans and reshaping survival itself, then what other hidden archives lie waiting beneath our feet? Records as fragile as dust, holding stories not yet read? And yet, if even the smallest grains of dust drifting across ice could alter the balance of survival, if particles that seemed weightless could turn glaciers into archives of memory, then what deeper stories might lie hiding far below, sealed away in the body of the planet itself? For beneath our feet stretches not silence, but a library, immense, unhurried, and almost unfathomable in its patience. It is a library without shelves, without binding, a library made of stone and sediment, of minerals recording events we can scarcely imagine. And it is only when we drill patiently and gently, deep into the Earth's skin, that we begin to glimpse the records it has been keeping in darkness for billions of years. Picture a core sample drawn upward from the depths. A narrow cylinder of stone, cleanly cut, layers of color and texture stacked upon one another like the pages of a hidden book. To most eyes, it may look like nothing more than rock. Muted whites, muted grays, bands of sediment pressed together without explanation. But when studied with care, each stratum tells a story, each shift in texture a turning of the page. Here lies volcanic ash from an eruption that blackened the skies long ago. There, a thin ribbon of carbonate, deposited during sudden warmth after an age of ice. Farther down lie fossil fragments. Foraminifera shells made of calcium, tiny skeletons carrying within them traces of oceans that flowed hundreds of millions of years before us. And deeper still are rocks folded under pressure, whispering of continents that collided, broke, drifted apart again. Every core is both artifact and confession, a library of scars and silences, preserved not for us, and yet available when we learn to read. What we uncover in such archives is not linear history, but layered memory. The Earth does not write chapters sequentially. It layers them, buries them, presses one atop another, so that each age becomes both preserved and obscured by the age that follows. Reading the archive requires removing the present to access the past, peeling back depth after depth. And in this deep ritual of uncovering, we learn not only about the planet, but about ourselves, about how fragile memory can be, about how much we are always forgetting, even as time insists on keeping an unbroken record around us. The archives reveal destruction as much as creation. Bands of clay mark sudden extinctions, when volcanic winters or asteroid impacts collapsed ecosystems. Dark streaks reveal moments when oceans grew anoxic, stripped of oxygen, suffocating life and leaving behind thick deposits of black shale. Pale ribbons of carbonate trace the return of life in seas reborn. Each pattern, each fragment, is part of the greater cycle, a cycle of catastrophe and renewal replayed countless times. It is humbling to realize that rebirth is always written beside ruin, that the very stones we admire for their endurance are also testimonies of impermanence. And yet, within this archive lies patience unlike anything we know. While our memories fade on scales of decades, the Earth has preserved these inscriptions for billions of years, waiting without urgency. Perhaps memory itself is not fragile if it is allowed to reside in stone. Perhaps it is only our kind of memory, written in words, in data, in fleeting human traces, that dissolves. The planet teaches us something different. That time is not lost if it is layered, if it settles into minerals, isotopes, fossils. Memory persists, not a story we can hear directly, but as a record always there, waiting for us to learn its language. When we take these cores in hand, we are not holding silence alone, we are holding vibrations of time compressed into tangible weight. Within them are isotopic ratios that tell us about ancient atmospheres, radioactive elements quietly ticking down into daughter products, acting as clocks to measure deep epochs. Foraminifera shells whose chemistry records the temperature of oceans at the moment they lived. Dust from deserts that no longer exist, sealed in marine sediments, evidence of winds across vanished lands. Each of these is a thread, fragile yet enduring, binding together eras we would otherwise lose to oblivion. And still, questions linger. How much is missing from the archive? How many layers have been subducted back into Earth's mantle, melted and erased beyond hope of retrieval? How many stories were folded and deformed into mountains, transformed by heat until their clarity was lost? Could it be that even the Earth forgets, not by design but by necessity? And if the planet itself forgets, erasing layers as it recycles itself, how trustworthy can our reconstruction ever be? Maybe what we call science is not the discovery of final truth, but the careful interpretation of fragments, reading echoes and distortions, much like we interpret our own memories, aware always of their incompleteness. And yet, completeness may not be the point. Perhaps fragments are enough. Perhaps the very gaps are part of the message, reminding us that history is never whole, that silence is as important as presence. The core samples remind us constantly of this, fat bands of sediment punctuated by sudden gaps, abrupt shifts, missing time. When we see this, we learn not only about ice ages and oceans, but about impermanence itself. Could it be that the greatest archive we have is not a complete one, but a fractured one, always asking us to lean closer, to imagine, to fill the silence with questions? And so, as we keep drilling deeper, as archives continue to emerge, we come closer to the haunting realization that Earth has always been remembering itself, even while erasing parts of its own story. This doubleness, the preservation and the forgetting, the memory and the silence, is the essence of its record. What is true of fossils, true of isotopes, true of sediments, is true again of cores. Nothing ever vanishes entirely, nothing ever remains whole. To fall asleep with this thought is to feel ourselves sinking into the strata as well, knowing that even our presence may one day be sediment, layered into the archive beneath someone else's feet. Perhaps our marks will be chemicals in soils, plastics pressed into seabeds, isotopes from machines and reactors distributing themselves quietly. Perhaps we too are part of Earth's confession, part of its patient memory, inseparable from its archive. And yet, if this much has been preserved beneath our feet, hidden in cores and layered in stone, what memories might the very air itself be holding, unseen, waiting patiently for us to listen? Unlike rock, which feels solid in our hands, or fossils etched visibly into sediment, the atmosphere seems weightless, intangible. And still, it is one of the most fragile archives the Earth has ever kept. We live inside it, breathing it without thought, trusting it instinctively, rarely considering how thin a veil it truly is. But this thinness, this transparency, is the product of millions of years of frozen experiments, an alchemy as delicate as it is enduring. Every breath carries with it the result of countless balances struck across deep time. Carbon dioxide that once surged into the sky from volcanoes has been locked away inside ice sheets and stones, hiding like memory folded between layers. Methane, that volatile, invisible spark of life's metabolism, has slept in permafrost, trapped in frozen hydrates as delicate as glass, waiting for its bonds to break with warmth. Oxygen itself, the element we rely upon not just to breathe but to ignite fire, to fuel our hearts and our mythologies, has wavered across time in unstable rhythms. Sometimes abundant, intoxicatingly high, other times meager, pressed downward by ecosystems collapsing under their own imbalance. What surrounds us now is not inevitable. It is not permanent. It is a fragile outcome of cycles tested and revised over billions of years. Imagine an ice sheet storing more than water. Each layer holds traces of the air of its age, tiny bubbles compressed into crystal walls. When we drill into glacial ice and bring up a core, it is not only a frozen artifact of snow, it is a container of atmosphere, sealed in silence for hundreds of thousands of years. When we release one, when we measure its composition, we are literally inhaling from an ancient sky, listening to the chemistry of forgotten climates. Could it be that air itself remembers more clearly than stone, Because it was always carrying the breath of the world? The atmosphere has teetered on edges again and again. Its chemistry reflects extinction and resurgence in equal measure. During glaciations, oxygen sometimes dipped precariously, reminding us that what we call breathable is not guaranteed. During explosions of cyanobacteria long ago, it surged upward, flooding the planet with gas that altered everything, even at times sparking fires across landscapes that had never before burned. This balance has always been unstable, fragile, mutable. And still, across all of those swings, life bent itself toward endurance, weaving each atmospheric experiment into a possibility for the future. Even now, isotopes preserved in ice cores give us the sequences of these changes, delicate ratios whispering of warmer periods, cooler periods, droughts, floods, collapses, growth. A flicker of carbon here, a decrease of oxygen there, each a marker of how the planet experiments with itself, searching for equilibrium and never quite holding it. To breathe the air we have now is to inhabit a narrow pause in those experiments, a balance that feels eternal only because our lifetimes are too brief to witness its unease. Perhaps this is why philosophers and scientists alike find awe in the simple act of breathing. Not because oxygen is abundant, but because it is not inevitable. It is a product of fragile feedback loops. Plants producing it, oceans storing it, soils consuming it. Disruptions in any of these could tip the sky into unfamiliar states, just as they have in forgotten epochs. To breathe deeply, then, is to accept a gift millions of years in the making, a gift maintained by organisms we often cannot see, by microbes in the ocean, by ice sheets holding back their silent cargo of carbon and methane. Breathing is not just survival, it is intimacy with deep time. And yet, the atmosphere does more than nourish life. Carries memory in motion. Winds shift particles. Storms distribute nutrients. Cycles redistribute warmth. Every gust is a conveyor of geological past. Every cloud's vapor contains atoms cycled through oceans and rocks, through volcanic vents and glacial rivers. Even entropy plays its role here, dissolving gradients, dispersing heat, smoothing differences in the constant search for balance. Like us, the air cannot keep still. Perhaps this is why it feels alive, though it has no heartbeat. It is always remembering where it has been, even as it moves restlessly toward where it is going. Could it be that the atmosphere is the closest thing we have to a planetary soul, thin yet immense, composed of breaths both ancient and present, fragile but continuous? We may never know for certain, but the thought is haunting. To recognize that what surrounds us isn't permanent stability but layered accident is to feel humility in every inhalation. The thin sky overhead is not secure. It is a fragile alchemy that carries scars of frozen epochs, whispers of catastrophic shifts, and the silence of forgotten ages. And so, as we return to this veil of air and the chemistry it holds, we find ourselves asking a larger question. If even the sky is fragile, if even breath is provisional, then what other futures might be encoded in this alchemy, waiting to unfold when conditions shift once again? And so, if even the air around us is fragile, a thin and temporary alchemy shaped by frozen experiments across deep time, we are left to wonder how slight the chances were that any of this balance came to be. Had the ice lingered longer, had the atmosphere leaned a little more toward silence than toward breath, the story of our world might have written itself differently. There are, hidden within Earth's history, not just the worlds that were, but the worlds that might have been, ghostly possibilities suspended in the spaces between conditions, futures nearly chosen and then abandoned. Imagine an Earth where the thaw never truly came, where glaciers kept extending their weight, sealing oceans beneath permanent glass, pressing continents deeper into the mantle's roots until even the faint warmth of volcanoes could not pierce the cold. In such a world, liquid water would have been trapped under layers too thick to break. Currents would have stilled, circulation lost, and with it the energy that life depends on. Photosynthesis might never have spread across seas. Cyanobacteria might have remained imprisoned under transparent ceilings of ice, too faint to oxygenate an atmosphere or ignite the evolutionary sparks that later followed. Life, in this ghostly version, survives only as whispers clinging to geothermal vents, microbial shadows breathing chemical reactions in exile, with no wider world to inhabit. Could such a planet be called Earth at all? Or would it be something else entirely? A giant moon of ice, pale and lifeless to distant eyes, slowly radiating its heat into emptiness until even motion within its depths became too faint to notice? Perhaps identity itself is fragile, not only for us, but for planets too. Earth became Earth only because the thaw returned. Without it, it would have been something else. Memory stifled, possibility silenced, an identity never allowed to surface. And yet, if this almost world had prevailed, it would not truly be empty. Chemistry does not halt. Entropy continues its patient course. Minerals would still dissolve and precipitate in silence. Isotopes would still tick their steady countdowns, waiting in stone to be measured by a reader that never arrived. Even in a frozen world without us, without forests, without rivers, a kind of record would remain. The quiet diary of elements pressed on, even if no one was left to translate. Perhaps this is the strangest truth of all, that worlds do not need witnesses to exist, yet they lean toward memory all the same. We should not see these lost possibilities only as absence, but as shadowed paths, 1,000 versions of Earth that nearly were. Worlds permanently locked in ice. Worlds scorched by volcanic overdose, wrapped in carbon thick beyond breath. Worlds where oxygen never rose above trace amounts, leaving seas forever green with microbes, but never blue with openness. Each of these paths was possible, and yet, by fractions, by accidents, by balances born of timing, our Earth leaned another way. Why this way and not the others? Was it pure chance? Or could it be that systems press toward continuation, toward survival, as though existence itself resists erasure more fiercely than we understand? Maybe, maybe not. For every world that exists, there are countless more that might have remained unseen, unmade, undone before unfolding. And yet their ghostly presence shapes how we look at what did come to be. To imagine them is to feel the precariousness of our own lives, to recognize how narrow the thread of possibility truly was. We breathe air now only because the ice retreated. We walk on continents sculpted by glaciers only because they also receded. Even thought itself, this moment of wondering together, exists because the world chose thaw over permanence. Could it have chosen otherwise? Could it still, someday? When scientists study exoplanets orbiting distant stars, they often search for traces of water and warmth, for atmospheres balanced enough to sustain complexity. In doing so, they are asking whether Earth's story is singular, or whether many such fragile worlds bloom and then fade across the galaxy. Perhaps some were locked as snowballs forever, carrying the same shadowed fate our planet almost carried. Perhaps some still are, their oceans cocooned in ice, never to thaw, distant cousins of our Earth reminding us of what almost happened here. To look outward is also to look inward, to recognize how improbable it is that we stand here at all, recounting not only what was but what might have been. And so, these shadow worlds, these might-have-beens, linger in our reflection. They are warnings, yes, but also quiet companions, teaching us to see the fragility of what is present. Nothing was guaranteed. Nothing ever is. And yet, if the Earth escaped the silence of permanent ice, if it broke free from that almost world, then what came after was not only survival but expression. An atmosphere reborn, currents rediscovered, life carried outward from shadows. Which leads us gently forward into another question. As identity takes shape out of survival, what kind of sky did the Earth then inherit as its crown? And so, as we leave behind the fragile visions of worlds that might have been, we find ourselves looking upward, to the veil above, the thin canopy of gases we take for granted. For even in those frozen centuries when oceans locked themselves in glass and life clung only to shadows, the sky was never entirely still. The atmosphere, fragile as it was, carried its own displays. Auroras shimmered over cold horizons, delicate curtains of light falling over the silence of white landscapes. Even in the darkest eras, when the planet seemed most severe, there was beauty written in the heavens, green fire rippling across frozen night. To see them then, across ancient ice, would have been to witness contrast at its most humbling. A world locked tight, hushed into stillness, but a sky alive with flowing color, streams of light spilling and curling as charged particles collided with atoms of oxygen and nitrogen in the upper air. Green and violet, crimson and pale blue shifted across the firmament. Magnetic storms from the sun traveled all the way across the cold distance to Earth, striking the atmosphere, painting the silence with strokes of transient brilliance. Could it be that this was nature's way of reminding the planet, and perhaps even life itself, that even when frozen, wonder still persisted? The science of it is simple enough: interactions between solar winds and Earth's magnetic shield. Yet to imagine it as only phenomenon is to miss its depth. For auroras are also whispers of memory. They remind us that even when surfaces freeze, when oceans pause, the Earth does not exist in isolation. It is joined always to its star, a relationship both fragile and immense. The sun sends its restless breath across space, and Earth replies not with words, but with light at its poles, arcs bending and scattering against the backdrop of darkness. In the frozen ages, these dances may have been brighter still, their colors refracting across clearer skies, uncontested by forests, fires, or cities. Perhaps they were the only living glow above the endless sweep of frozen silence. And what might it have felt like to watch them? No sound would reach the ear. No warmth would follow them down through the cold air. They are beauty without utility, presence without permanence, a phenomenon meant only to be seen. In that way, they resemble memory itself, bright, fleeting, sustaining us in some intangible way but slipping away even as it occurs. Did microbes sealed beneath the ice need auroras? Did they see them? No. And yet, the auroras came regardless, nature insisting that wonder does not ask for audience to exist. We might think of the sky then as fragmented because it was so unlike our sky today. The oxygen balance was different, the particles carried unfamiliar signatures, the chemistry itself was in flux. Ancient gases written into ice cores suggest a sky that shifted hue, perhaps tinted differently than the blue we know so well. Imagine a sky fainter, paler, carrying its alchemy unsettled, with auroras flickering against it as constant reminders of instability and resilience. Memory scattered, refracted upward, expressed through color. Perhaps there is something profoundly comforting in this. That beauty endures when nature seems cruel. That light dances even in silence. Could it be that auroras arriving in those dark ages were the planet's way of holding on to its identity, refusing to be erased entirely into cold? Maybe the sky was keeping a kind of diary of its own, one written not in sediment or isotopes, but in open displays of radiance witnessed by no one at all. And so we ask, as we drift beneath the fragmented sky of memory, what is more haunting? That the auroras danced across an empty world with no eyes to witness them, or that their light still carries on today, resilient across epochs, as though beauty itself knows endurance? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps it is not the witnessing that matters, but the continuity, the thought that Earth has always been capable of such fragile radiance, even in its darkest times. And if the skies could remember through light, painting fire across the silence to remind the cosmos of Earth's resilience, then what of the ground below? What catastrophes were being stored there, quietly pressed into stone, waiting for us to uncover? For if auroras are fleeting echoes in the heavens, fossils of catastrophe are the echoes hidden beneath our feet, still carrying their testimony forward through the fractures of time. And if the skies could shimmer with fire above a frozen planet, if auroras rippled across horizons where no voices watched, then what of the ground below? What stories, darker and more enduring, were being pressed into the silence of stone? Because if light is fleeting, fossils are its opposite. Preserved testimonies of lives ended, written quietly in sediment and compression. Some of the most profound pages in Earth's long record are not the chapters of abundance, but the intervals of catastrophe, when death itself became widespread enough to warrant inscription. And many of these extinctions bear icy fingerprints. Mass deaths sealed in frozen waters, entire ecosystems stilled, erased in silence, then left behind as bone and shell turned ghost. To look at these fossils today is to confront patterns of vanishing. A collection of trilobites huddled together in deposits that indicate sudden cold, seas turned anoxic beneath advancing ice. Entire lineages of plankton disappearing from the cores of ocean sediments, leaving abrupt breaks in continuity. Shell beds piled atop one another not slowly, but rapidly, smothered in sediments delivered by glacial outburst floods or by currents shocked into imbalance when climates turned suddenly harsh. These fossils are not just isolated artifacts of life. They are echoes of endings. They speak of ecosystems unraveling, of food chains collapsing, of thresholds crossed and never reversed. And yet, even here, especially here, the record is not simple. Because alongside erasure, we see rebirth. The fossils tell us of interruptions, not absolute endings, of life pressed hard against the brink, only to reappear again in new forms, in new niches, written back into presence after silence. Extinction and survival occur entwined, as if catastrophe itself were both scythe and teacher. Could it be that evolution learns more in disaster than in stability? That fragile rebirth is made possible only by fragile erasure? Geology preserves evidence in ways that feel almost too raw. Isotopic trails show sudden collapses in carbon, oxygen, and sulfur cycles, chemical signatures that align with fossil gaps. Patterns etched into rock suggest seas stagnated under heavy ice, oxygen stripped away, entire species suffocating while the cold sealed them beneath. Even coral skeletons, when they reappear, carry different architectures. Fossils of catastrophe are not just remains. They are switches, visible records of the planet redefining itself after endings. And perhaps that is the strangest thought of all. That death, when collected in numbers vast enough, becomes creative. That absence, repeated and layered through time, shapes the opportunities for what follows. Not because extinction is kind, but because entropy, transformation, and collapse are etched into the workings of geology itself. The fossils show us that nothing lasts untouched. Everything is rearranged, and even erasure can fold itself forward into fragile rebirth. It is easy, standing in the present, to look upon extinction solely as tragedy. And it is. But fossils of catastrophe remind us that endings have been here many times before, long before us, long after us still to come. Tiny brachiopods in ancient shales, algae sealed in layers of cap carbonate, ammonites curled into limestone. They all tell the same story, that life can flourish, falter, and yet the world moves on, remembering but never halting. These are not tragedies in isolation. They are episodes in a planetary rhythm. And somehow, against silence, the rhythm always continues, even when the song changes voice. But we should not mistake endurance for permanence. Many lives left no descendants, vanished entirely into fossil gaps too abrupt to recover. Whole experiments of evolution, ecologies, lineages, symmetries, are gone forever, except as fossils on the bottom of rivers and seas. What would it mean to imagine not only the lives we know, but the lives erased entirely, their memory carried only by stone? Could it be that the majority of Earth's story is written in absence, that we are always looking at an incomplete page, assembled out of what entropy allowed to remain? And yet, incomplete does not mean silent. A fish skeleton sealed in shale, smothered in a flood of silt from retreating ice, still tells us of heat that once lingered, water that once moved, an organism that once endured until endurance became impossible. Fossils are absence turned into presence, fragments against forgetting. Perhaps, in the deep quiet hours, to hold one in our hand is to admit that lives need not be whole to be meaningful, that sometimes fragments are enough to remind us of continuity. And so we sway between wonder and humility, between loss and endurance. For what fossils of catastrophe ask us most clearly is a question not of past, but of future. If the Earth has folded countless ecosystems into extinction before, sealed them into ice and stone, what guarantee do we have that our own presence is any different? Could it be that one day, long after we're gone, our remains will become part of this same archive? Our artifacts, our bones, our technofossils pressed into rock, fragments not telling of triumph but of another turnover, another fragile rebirth seeded by endings? The thought is unsettling but also steadying. For catastrophe does not end the story, it changes it. Fossils prove this over and over. They do not erase, they transmute. What ended once may reappear again in a stranger, newer rhythm. And yet, if so many worlds of life have closed their chapters in ice, leaving only fossils as pale echoes of catastrophe, then we must turn to the moment after erasure, when destruction gave way to sudden change. For what followed extinction was never simple calm, never gentle transition. As ice finally withdrew from its dominion, it did so not silently, but in ruptures. The white silence broke open, cracked by forces long contained, by floods unleashed, by torrents that sculpted landscapes in hours where once it would have taken centuries. The retreat of ice was not a tidy dissolving, but a tearing, a bursting, chaos-creating form. Imagine the weight of a glacier pressing on valleys for thousands of years, holding rivers motionless, lakes dammed behind walls of frozen force. Beneath the ice, water pooled in secret darkness, melt collecting in hollowed basins where light never reached. And then the fracture would come. Sometimes sudden, sometimes inevitable, the ice wall giving way, releasing waters with the power to shear through whole landscapes. Torrents flooded outward, scouring plains, uprooting soils, dragging boulders the size of houses, sculpting canyons not over eons, but in single restless days. Valleys we now walk as if they were carved slowly and patiently were, in truth, born of catastrophe. Raging floods imprinting new geography in an instant. Geology preserves the memory of this violence, though softened by patient time. In North America, in Asia, in Africa, in Australia, we find these marks. Channels cut too wide and too deep to belong to rivers alone, coulees and scablands marking the paths of floods that raced across entire regions, erratics carried from one end of continents to another, stranded like punctuation in the quiet fields they rest in now. Each one tells us the same story, that what appears as permanence began in chaos. Catastrophe, not gentleness, delivered much of the beauty we now call ordinary. And beneath the surface, too, silence fractured. Ocean currents long interrupted by ice began to stir again. Warm water flowed into new routes. Salinity shifted. Circulation rebalanced itself. These movements are not just fluid, they are alive with consequence. Each current carries oxygen, carries nutrients, carries memory itself, distributing what the frozen epoch had hoarded. In this redistribution, possibilities for ecosystems bloomed again, habitats opening not because they were kindly granted, but because they were violently cleared. The cracks in the white silence were not just absences, they were invitations. Perhaps there is meaning in this contradiction. We crave gradualness, we find comfort in gentle unfurling. But Earth reminds us that birth often arrives messy, abrupt, unyielding. Beauty often begins in fracture. Landscapes of silence yielded waterfalls, valleys, fertile plains not because I stepped aside politely, but because it broke, it cracked, it rushed away in floods that did not ask permission. Could it be that life itself is always reborn in chaos, never through stability alone? That renewal and rupture are inseparable? And yet, as the torrents receded, stillness returned once again. Valleys scoured bare grew quiet. Lakes left behind from broken glaciers mirrored fresh skies. In the silence after the flood, soils formed anew. Rivers established order in channels once carved by violence. Life crept back across terrain that only hours before had been swept bare. Perhaps this is the odd rhythm of Earth's memory, that silence and chaos take turns as authors, leaving behind landscapes that carry both their handwriting at once. In some places, glaciers did not burst but retreated slowly, still cracking, still shattering as they pulled back. Their motion was massive but intricate, grinding rock into flour, depositing it in wide plains, places that now serve as fertile ground for entire ecosystems. Destruction becoming soil, soil becoming life, memory embedded first in loss and then in growth. Every grain of sediment carried by a retreating ice sheet was a fragment of mountain, worn into nourishment for futures it could not foresee. Could it be that nourishment itself is always tied to past catastrophe, that we live today in the soil of yesterday's violence? And so, when we walk valleys carved by vanished glaciers, when we trace rivers whose corridors were born in outburst floods, when we rest in fertile plains rich with minerals once locked in ice, we are, without knowing, cradled by catastrophe. The landscapes we call serene, the places we find beautiful, are pages written first by fracture. Perhaps this is what Earth teaches most of all, that silence and chaos are not opposites, but companions, alternating presences that build memory together. And yet, if the Earth's beauty could be born in the cracks of white silence, if valleys and plains could be sculpted in hours by waters freed from their frozen prisons, we are left with the question: how do we know? How can we measure what vanished long before we watched? For silence itself leaves few voices behind. To listen, we turn to chemistry. We turn to isotopes, those quiet clocks etched invisibly into minerals, into ice, into shells. Through them, we measure the echoes of ages that neither fossils nor landscapes can tell in full. They are the smallest archivists, yet the most faithful. To hold a piece of stone or ice and trace its isotopic ratios is to look into time itself. Oxygen, for instance, exists in multiple forms. Some atoms just slightly heavier than others, their mass altered by a whisper of extra neutrons. In warm ages, lighter isotopes evaporate more easily, leaving oceans enriched in the heavier kind. In colder ages, heavier forms remain locked in rain and snow, massing inside glaciers that preserve their balance for millennia. What results is a rhythm, a fingerprint unique to temperature, captured in shells, in ice bubbles, in crystals deep in the Earth's crust. The ratio becomes a diary, one we can still read. It shows us not only what happened, but when, aligning ancient climates to the slow unfolding of deep time. And as we trace these ratios, we uncover whispers that fossilize in no bone, that leave no obvious scar in landscapes. Isotopes do not tell us what lived, but they tell us the conditions life endured. They speak of oceans warmed after sudden volcanism, or stilled into cold by advancing ice. Carbon isotopes map the breadth of ancient organisms, revealing shifts between abundance and collapse. Strontium ratios measure the trade between continents and seas, the slow grinding of erosion and uplift. Each element holds its tale, written with precision not for us, but offering itself when we finally learn to listen. Perhaps what makes isotopes so haunting is their impartiality. Fossils are fragile, selective, disappearing where preservation fails. Stones may erode, landscapes may shift, but isotopes within the minerals continue ticking with patient honesty. Radioactive elements decay predictably, having themselves across fixed intervals of time, whispering their chronology into every shard of zircon, every grain of uranium-bearing crystal. These isotopic clocks never lie. They do not exaggerate, they do not falter. They persist as delicate threads across deep time, assuring us that memory is not only human, it resides in matter itself. And yet, even in their clarity, questions linger in the air. What does it mean that truth is stored in atoms, in chemical balances, in decay so slow our entire lives count for nothing against it? Do we read memory? Or do we merely extract a rhythm so vast it feels like memory? Is the isotope itself recording? Or are we simply translating consequence into narrative? Maybe memory is not an act of intention but a byproduct of existence, something every particle carries whether or not a witness remains. There is a stillness in imagining this, that every rock you hold, every shell that ever lived, every ice crystal pressed beneath the poles carries truth invisibly woven into its atoms. That long after us, those atoms will continue whispering their ratios, faithful beyond thought, faithful beyond witness. Perhaps in this patience lies a deeper kind of honesty than humans can ever hope for. Our memories alter with time, bend, distort, but the isotope waits, unchanged in its balance, until someone, something, calls on it again. Isotopes remind us of entropy, but not only its decay. They remind us that entropy creates endurance, not just endings. That the passage of time produces clocks, reliable, steady. In them, loss becomes record, silence becomes signal. A frozen bubble of gas in the heart of an ancient glacier is an isotope's way of saying, here once, the balance was this. Could it be that truth is not spoken but left behind, embedded into chemistry, faithful without intention? And so, memory exists everywhere. not only in minds, not only in writing, but in elements, in ratios, in the quiet unfolding of nuclear processes. Maybe to be real, in any form, is always to remember, because matter itself cannot escape leaving traces. Maybe memory is less a miracle than we think, and more a law, one that pervades every scale, from fossils pressed in ice to isotopes within minerals billions of years old. And yet, if isotopes can hold memory more faithfully than we ever could, if every element carries within it a diary of time unnoticed, then glaciers themselves emerge as even greater clocks. Vast, slow mirrors holding not only chemistry but movement, soundless witnesses to ages as they pass. To look upon ice is to look not only at frozen water, but at a mirror of time itself, reflecting what was, what is, and what inevitably comes again. Glaciers advance and retreat not in moments, but in spans so vast they escape our senses. They flow the way mountains might dream of moving, so slowly that to watch them feels like waiting for silence to breathe. Yet as they move, they record. Snow falls layer upon layer, compresses, crystallizes, thickens, transforms. Each year of snowfall becomes another page in their pale archive, etched not in ink but in density, in trapped bubbles of air, in the ratio of isotopes sealed within. These layers stack upward and downward, the surface erased by wind while the depths preserve memory unbroken. It is in these depths that glaciers function as clocks, calibrating time in units of thousands, even millions of years. What makes ice extraordinary is that it remembers even as it forgets. At the surface, it reflects sunlight back into space, showing us only luminous whiteness, a silence too bright to decipher. But within, below, hidden in compressed transparency, lie stories delicate enough to measure the breadth of ancient skies. Tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide, methane, and oxygen are locked into place. A museum of atmospheres traveling with the glacier, moving imperceptibly forward, yet never releasing their truth until we choose to listen. To drill into an ice core is not only to sample frozen water, it is to retrieve a time capsule, a fragment of sky that once floated above oceans long gone. And in this way, glaciers do not merely exist in time, they embody it. They are clocks that move while they remember. And perhaps the deepest wonder is how small the changes are that ripple endlessly forward. A fraction of a degree shift in temperature frozen into a layer of firn. A slight rise in carbon dioxide preserved within an air bubble. A trace of volcanic ash scattering across a white surface, settling gently and held intact in ice for centuries. Each faint mark compounds, accumulates, reshapes oceans, climates, futures. When we look at glaciers today, we do not only see ice, but all the tiny ripples magnified across millennia, small records building into vast consequence. Could it be that all time is written this way, not in grand events, but in repetitions so small they escape notice until silence reveals them? In this rhythm, glaciers also remind us of fragility. A clock can be broken, a mirror can fracture. As ice retreats today more rapidly than in past ages, its clock seems to skip, its calibration falters. We measure its absence, its thinning, its accelerated release of ancient gases, and in doing so, we begin to realize how deeply we rely on the continuity of timekeepers that do not belong to us. Perhaps the loss of ice is not only environmental, but existential, the breaking of a mirror in which the planet once reflected its rhythms with patience. And yet glaciers endure still, in the highest reaches, in the farthest poles, carrying their silent archives forward. They remain not only masses of frozen water, but teachers of time. They slow us down, invite us to think in units larger than ourselves, larger even than our species, showing us that what seems permanent can be fleeting, and what seems fragile can last for billions of breaths more than any one of us. Maybe, in the end, they exist as reminders that time is both mirror and movement, both memory and forgetting. And so, as we contemplate ice not only as substance but as clock, as mirror, as archive, we must ask quietly. If glaciers can remember in such exquisite, patient silence, then what else have they carried forward beyond ice, beyond us? What secrets might be sealed deeper than we can ever reach, memories waiting patiently for discovery, or perhaps waiting always to remain hidden? And yet, if glaciers can remember in such exquisite, patient silence, if they can hold the air of vanished skies and the fingerprints of ancient suns, then a more unsettling question surfaces. What else might they be holding? Because if stone can cradle fossils of catastrophe, if isotopes can preserve rhythm without distortion, then glaciers too may carry more than chemistry. They might be libraries not only of climate but of civilizations, if such civilizations ever existed before us. Speculative voices have long whispered about such possibilities. What if Earth, in its restless cycles, harbored other rises, other bloomings of intelligence, long before we arrived? What if beneath the advancing sheets of ancient ice, or erased in cataclysms long since folded into tectonic silence, there lie remains of forgotten societies, small, delicate, but proof that we were not the first to think or build or dream? Could ice itself have become the eraser, smoothing away all signs of hands that built, voices that spoke, leaving only fragments, technofossils buried and sealed within permafrost, awaiting some far future thaw? Of course, the archive is stingy. Glaciers grind, compress, scour. They are both preservers and destroyers. Organic matter rarely survives. Structures collapse under the weight. And yet, so too do glaciers protect. In their deepest layers, they can keep fragile tissues intact across tens of thousands of years. Entire mammoths lie preserved in Siberian ice, hair and skin still clinging to bone, carrying the smell of ancient grass in their stomachs. Pollen remains, layered and sealed, reveal the landscapes that once grew where ice now spreads. If such traces can survive, then could greater traces as well. Could it be that entire pages of Earth's memory, technological or otherwise, are locked within ice, beyond our reach until balance shifts again? And speculation is not only fanciful. Today we speak of technofossils, plastics, alloys, isotopes from nuclear reactions, the scars we ourselves embed into the planet. These are durable markers, woven into sediments, waiting to signal our presence far into the future. Even if we vanished tomorrow, these technofossils would persist, layered into geology. So we ask, if our traces will endure, could other epochs have left similar signatures now lost, erased by cycles of subduction, erosion, or glacial advance? Could entire fabrications of past intelligence be buried beyond sight, confused with the natural, dismissed as coincidence? Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is humility, to recognize that visibility in the fossil record is never guaranteed. The probability of preservation is rare even for bones and shells. For fragile constructs of civilization, survival would be rarer still. Deep time does not favor memory. It favors transformation. If we measure by millions of years, the chances of recovery blur to near zero. And yet, we cannot look at the blankness without wondering. Silence is never proof of absence. Silence can mean erasure. Silence can mean forgetting. Silence can hide. Maybe civilizations are as ephemeral as blooms of plankton between ice ages, brief intervals erased almost completely, their memory reduced to chemistry in cores we only half understand. And still, the glaciers tempt us. They are both veil and revelation. A thaw uncovers ancient forests hidden beneath the ice. Fossils preserved in glacial till emerge after centuries. Entire landscapes, once thought gone, are released from burial, returning their stories. If ecosystems and mammoths can wait in ice, why not something more? Not because it is likely, but because it is possible, however faintly, and possibility is enough to remind us of our ignorance. What does it mean to imagine such shadow civilizations? Could they have arisen between glaciations, fragile in their warmth, only to be smothered when ice returned? Could they have advanced upon coastlines now long drowned, erased not by ice but by sea level rise, swallowed quietly into the continental shelf? Could subduction have carried their memory downward already, melted them into the mantle as if they had never existed? Maybe, maybe not. But to wonder is to admit how much of Earth's memory is always partial, always provisional. And in these speculations we return also to ourselves. For we too dwell in fragile climates. We too leave marks we believe eternal. Yet our permanence is uncertain. A bridge of steel, a city of glass, a network of satellites orbiting in the dark. All may seem indestructible in the short spans of our lives, but in deep time, none are secure. Ice can pull them down, stone can grind them smooth, oceans can wash them away. Our own technofossils may be all that is left, scattered inexplicably across strata. Could we not then be the very thing we speculate about? An experiment of intelligence briefly flowering, then buried, remembered only as strange residue in future cores? There is a poetry in this humility. Civilization itself becomes fragile, fleeting not in its meaning but in its endurance. We write libraries, we build monuments, we create archives of thought and image, and yet the glaciers remind us that memory is seldom voluntary. It belongs as much to accident as to intention. The world may keep some of our traces. It may erase most of them. And if something other than us ever arose and vanished, then perhaps their memory too was consigned to silence, folded into snow and ice, scattered as dust, waiting still. And maybe that is the essence of Earth's memory, that what lasts longest is not certainty, but speculation. Not complete chronicles, but possibilities, gaps, whispers that echo across thought. If forgotten civilizations once walked here, their silence lingers not to taunt us, but to remind us that even absence has depth. Even what is unseen has presence in imagination. Could it be that silence itself is the most profound kind of memory, a canvas onto which we project both what was and what might have been? And yet, if ice can erase as easily as it preserves, if whole possibilities of civilization or story can vanish into its frosted silence, then perhaps the deeper truth is this: the planet has always been writing with or without us. Every fold of rock, every scar of glacier, every buried remnant of atmosphere is less a random scattering of events than a kind of autobiography. Pages written patiently in stone, written in patterns of wind and water, written again in the silence of extinction and the reawakening of life. The ice ages, fragile and immense, were chapters in this ongoing text, entries in the long narrative of a restless planet trying, endlessly, to remember itself. To think of Earth as autobiographer is to shift how we see its landscapes. Valleys are no longer only valleys. They are sentences scratched into bedrock. Fossils are no longer simply residues of presence. They are characters, voices inhabiting the story as briefly as ink pressed into a fragile page. Ice cores are chapters layered carefully, with margins filled by trapped air and volcanic ash, annotations added by particles of dust flowing across continents. None of these were meant to be storytelling, and yet together they create one. Not because intention shaped them, but because existence cannot help but leave a trace. The ice ages reveal themselves as some of the most compelling passages in this diary. They arrive like long pauses, silences stretching across deep time, where the tone of the autobiography becomes subdued, almost withdrawn. Periods when warmth never left completely, but when cold carried the pen instead, inscribing landscapes with slow strokes of ice. Then, intervals of thaw, like quick memoirs of resurgence, brief movements into narrative flourish before silence returned again. It is as though the earth spoke most clearly not in smooth continuity, but in rhythms, in alternating verses of presence and absence, of ice and water. Could it be that autobiography itself is never steady? Could it be that memory, planetary or human, is always written in rhythms of stopping and beginning again? The autobiography of the planet is not always easy to read. Entropy blurs letters, subduction swallows entire lines, folding words back into molten silence. Whole chapters collapse, their sentences carried down into the mantle, re-emerging millions of years later as new crust, as new handwriting written in fire. Some entries are distorted, tilted layers, twisted seams, like memories recalled imperfectly after being retold too often. And yet, these distortions are not meaningless. They remind us that memory, whether Earth's memory or our own, is always imperfect, always refracted, but still carries resonance enough to be recognized. In the autobiography of the planet, silence itself becomes part of the record. Fossil gaps are not only mistakes of preservation. They are deliberate blank spaces, reminding us that not every life is remembered, not every era is recoverable. Atmospheres once dense with methane or carbon dioxide have evaporated almost entirely, leaving only isotope trails as faint highlights of their presence. The ice ages, in particular, are full of such silences. We know they occurred because of grooves carved into stone, because of sediments collected across oceans, because of chemistry caught in bubbles of ice. But we cannot fully know what worlds were lost within them. Could entire ecosystems have risen unseen? Could whole symmetries of life have unfolded and vanished, unrecorded except in silence? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps autobiography is always like this. More gaps than content, more shadows than clarity. And yet, the autobiography carries continuity. When we read core samples, when we trace isotopes, when we piece together fossils, we follow the threads back and see that despite silences, despite erasures, the narrative has never ceased being written. That is philosophy, but also science, the simple recognition that nothing leaves no trace. Even absence arranges itself as memory. To fall asleep inside such thoughts is to feel that autobiography folded into us. 2. We are not separate from the planet's story. Our bones someday will be sediment. Our cities will be entries, whether as ruins pressed into soil or as technofossils sealed into future strata. Our breath has already altered the chemistry of atmosphere, written its mark into oceans, and left its ink inside the quiet calculus of isotopes. We are an entire chapter still unwritten midway, not because Earth chose us, but because Earth writes all who step upon it. And so we look back on the ice ages, fragments of a grand diary, and realize they are not just scientific cycles or physical changes, but narrative passages. They hold tone, pacing, rhythm. They remind us that autobiography is not only about presence but about absence, about memory and forgetting braided together in silence. And this leads us to ask, if every scar and layer is part of Earth's ongoing self-description, then what improvisations are still being written, hidden beneath the shifting continents, waiting for the future to turn another page? And so, if the ice ages were chapters in the planet's autobiography, if they filled in pages we almost lost, then continents themselves were part of its shifting script, wanderers in deep time, moving slowly across the face of the Earth, sometimes into warmth, sometimes into silence, and sometimes into the frozen corridors of polar night. Plate tectonics is not just motion beneath our feet. It is the stage upon which ice advances and retreats, the slow drift of landmasses into latitudes where glaciers claim them, carrying forests into extinction and turning deserts white. We rarely think of continents as travelers, but they are. What seems permanent to us, mountains, rivers, soils, coastlines, is in truth a passing arrangement, as fragile and fleeting as clouds in the longer view. Land rides on plates, floating on mantle currents, slowly converging, colliding, parting again. And when they stray too far into the polar regions, they wander into prisons of ice. Think of a lush forest thriving near the tropics, drifting inch by inch over millions of years until it crosses invisible thresholds of latitude, until seasons shorten, pale snow lingers, until cold forests wither and tundra advances, until finally glaciers march over their roots. In stone, we see the remains of this story. Coal seems deep in Antarctica, memories of forests that thrived there when the continent had not yet drifted into its icy exile. The same is true for deserts. Regions once dry, vast expanses of sand-weathered landscapes, carried slowly by tectonic drift into higher latitudes. In time, their faces turned white, dunes swallowed in glacial ice, silence replacing the shifting rhythms of wind. What we call permanent biomes are not permanent at all. They are temporary guests at changing latitudes, and their migrations often end in disappearance. Could it be that every ecosystem, every forest, every desert carries within it a hidden fate, written not just in climate but in the map of plates beneath it? The evidence is everywhere. Fossil pollen appears in sediments beneath ice sheets where no plants grow today. Glacial grooves cut across bedrock worn smooth by ancient tropical rains, like layered palimpsests written by different climates. Mineral trails reveal when seas flooded inland plains, only to freeze and retreat as continents kept moving north or south. Even isotopic patterns in rocks remind us that what was once lush can be buried in snow, and what was frozen may one day return to warmth, pendulums swinging not just on timescales of climate, but through the slow choreography of continental drift. It is strange, almost hypnotic, to imagine the continents like living beings, endlessly migrating, endlessly reshaping their identities as they enter new latitudes. Each carries history on its shoulders. Fossils of ecosystems gone, marks of volcanoes that once thrived along ancient shorelines, scars of glaciers that advanced and retreated a dozen times. The landscapes we walk today are seams of wanderers, North America pressed against Africa, India smashing into Asia, Antarctica drifting silently into its current solitude. How much life was carried to extinction simply because the ground beneath it would not stay still? How many silences in the fossil record are really the echoes of land moving into or out of frozen corridors? Perhaps this is why the planet's autobiography feels so poignant, because it reminds us that nothing is fixed. Mountains rise and vanish. Forests grow and dissolve. Continents shift into silence, then out again, carrying traces of memory but never permanence. We may think of ice as the destroyer, but it is only the symptom. The true author is motion, the slow push and pull beneath, tectonics cracking and stitching the planet's skin, ensuring no moment endures longer than its allotted time. And yet, in this restlessness lies continuity. Even as forests died moving into ice, other ecosystems arose elsewhere, seeded by fragments drifting into warmth. Even as deserts disappeared under white silence, new deserts were born in lower latitudes, replacing the ones lost. The story never stops. It only shifts its stage. Perhaps identity itself is less about permanence than persistence, about always writing new lines even when old ones fade. And so, when we look at continents today, frozen and warm, lush and barren, we must remember that each is in transit. Antarctica's snow conceals a memory of forests. Africa's deserts hint at wetter pasts. Asia's mountains are reminders of oceans that once lay between colliding plates. All of them are still moving. All of them are still writing. And yet, if continents themselves cannot keep still, if every forest and desert is carried inevitably into silence or rebirth by forces beneath our feet, then the deeper question rises. How does life endure at all? For nothing in this story is stable. Land shifts, ice advances, climates collapse into unfamiliar rhythms. And still, through all of it, life goes on. It falters, it fragments, it retreats to the margins, but it does not vanish. There, in the harshest corners of vanished worlds, survival reveals itself as a paradox. Fragile, yet unyielding. Delicate, yet more persistent than stone itself. A flame beneath a suffocating blanket. Imagine the frozen planet during its long glaciations. Oceans sealed by glassy ice, continents ground into silence. Sunlight barely penetrates the surface, and warmth evaporates into space. To look upon such a world is to imagine death absolute, an erasure written from pole to pole. And yet, quietly, stubbornly, warmth persisted. At the bottom of oceans, vents exhaled heat from Earth's restless interior. Chemical reactions there fed microbial communities, entire ecosystems invisible to the surface. In caves and subglacial lakes, liquid water clung to rock faces warmed by pressure and geothermal breath. Even in brines saturated with salt, unwilling to freeze, life endured. Not in abundance, but in persistence. This is the paradox. Life is fragile. It can die from too much heat, too much cold, too little oxygen. It is vulnerable to entropy, to collapse, to even the smallest imbalance. And yet, through the ages, life has proven to be more resilient than anything we might call solid. The hardest stone fractures, the tallest mountain erodes, but cells, invisible and delicate, keep rewriting themselves into existence. They persist not because conditions are kind, but because persistence in itself seems to be the essence of life. Could it be that fragility and endurance are not contradictions at all, but partners? That life survives precisely because it bends, flickers, withdraws to the smallest refuges, then expands again when silence lifts? The fossil record shows us glimpses of this resilience. After each catastrophe, traces of microbial mats reappear. After the longest freezes, Plankton leaves its chemical fingerprints in ocean sediments, marking the return of photosynthesis the moment light and nutrients allowed. Coral-like organisms appear again in brief windows of warmth, each one fragile, each one vulnerable, yet able to return after millions of years in absence. This is life's paradox. It vanishes easily, but it also reemerges easily, carried forward unseen in margins, in shadows, in places even ice cannot erase. Perhaps endurance is not about strength at all but about dispersal. Life spreads thin into niches no I would seek, into pores of rock heated faintly by mantle warmth, into films of briny liquid beneath glaciers, into fumaroles releasing steam into snowbound tundra. By being fragile, by being small, life increases the odds that some part of itself continues. Survival here is not loud, not expansive, but whispering, and waiting. And from this paradox comes an unsettling reflection. Survival does not require thriving, only continuation. A single microbe in darkness carries as much memory forward as an entire ecosystem. A frozen seed beneath ice requires only the right thaw to begin again. Perhaps it is we who think of survival as abundance, while in nature survival may be near invisible, carried quietly until conditions shift. Could our definition of resilience be too dramatic? Maybe the truest form of perseverance is not conquest, but stillness. Not dominance, but patience. The paradox extends to us as well. Humanity builds fragile structures, writes fragile archives, creates delicate systems of food and shelter, all vulnerable to collapse. And yet, like the microbes under vents, we too seek warmth wherever it glimmers. We adjust, we migrate, we adapt. We carry seeds of survival forward unwittingly, embedding them into memory, into technology, into our children. We may not be as invincible as mountains, but perhaps our fragility is what allows us to endure. Geology reminds us constantly that the paradox of survival is written in silence. Ice ages that should have ended everything did not. Extinctions that wiped most of existence still left fragments which grew again. When entropy presses hardest, life folds itself smaller, protected by insignificance. This is resilience. Not resistance, but retreat. Not permanence, but return. So as we imagine life surviving under suffocating ice, as we picture fragile organisms clinging to geothermal warmth or drifting in brine beneath glaciers, we must also ask, how much of survival exists unseen right now, beneath us, beside us, overlooked, waiting for its time? How much of our faith in fragility is misplaced, when all along fragility carries the very mechanism of endurance? And yet, if survival itself is paradox, if existence continues not in blaze but in whispers sheltered beneath the cold, then what happens when silence finally loosens its grip? What happens when the stillness of ice breaks open, and motion, long postponed, returns to the land? The thaw was not only a release of warmth, it was the reawakening of rivers. After centuries of suspension, water moved again, and in that motion it sang. Picture a glacier retreating, its heavy body yielding at last. What was once pressed into silence begins to flow. The smallest trickle surface first, running through cracks carved deep by pressure, carrying drops that have been locked for thousands of years. Those trickles gather, joining into streams that snake across the raw ground exposed beneath, cutting into soils softened by melt, rushing impatient toward lower places. Before long, silence becomes song. Rivers swelling with energy, carving valleys, spreading sediments, racing outward to find seas that waited for their embrace. But these waters carried more than themselves. They bore the memory of ages compressed in ice. Dust blown from forgotten deserts, trapped in glacial layers, was freed and mingled again with air and soil. Minerals, ground into powder by frozen weight, were swept into the flows, enriching plains far downstream. Even microscopic remains, pollen, shells, fragments of organisms erased from their times, were carried on the river's shoulders, spread into new lands, repurposed as foundations for future life. Every drop, every current, held with it a piece of centuries sealed in silence, now released to join the living earth once more. Geologists read this memory in riverbeds today. Broad valleys too wide for the rivers now flowing within them speak of torrents unleashed in moments of sudden release, outburst floods that scoured entire basins in hours. Fine silts spread across plains, their chemistry rich in ground stone, testify that glaciers ground mountains into dust and placed them as gifts to soils we now call fertile. Even the meandering patterns of modern rivers trace their histories back to these primal awakenings, a memory of violence reshaped into gentleness over time. Could it be that every river we see today carries not just water, but inheritance, of ice, of silence, of release? The return of rivers was more than geology. It was the beginning of renewal. Along their edges, ecosystems seeded themselves again. Microbes clung to sediments, algae bloomed in shallow flows, plants rooted in freshly delivered mineral-rich soils. Rivers are not only movers of earth, they are givers of possibility. Where they wander, life follows. Perhaps this has always been true, that life emerges most readily along edges, along currents, where motion breaks stillness and renewal finds a path. And yet, even within their generosity, rivers remind us of fragility, for their flows can erase as easily as they create. Villages in our time, entire landscapes in deep time, have been swept away by floods too sudden to resist. The very valleys rivers carve are scars of their power, as much absence as gift. But in the scale of deep time, even this paradox feeds the pattern. Destruction sculpts opportunity. Erasure leaves behind foundations. Renewal follows silence not because silence was kind, but because silence ended. Perhaps that is why rivers feel alive to us. Because in their movement we sense time itself rediscovered, memory released from ice, stories carried forward. Survival in silence is paradox. Renewal in rivers is its answer. The waters cut land as if rewriting forgotten lines, inscribing histories across plains, etching memory into motion. Could it be that rivers are the voice of the thaw, the earth speaking again after centuries locked mute? And so the rivers awoke, restless, carrying sediments, carrying pasts, carrying futures not yet realized. They revealed that nothing is truly forgotten, only rearranged, waiting for release. And yet, if waters can carry the memories of silence, what then of the ice itself? What secrets remain locked within it, still waiting to speak, hidden deeper than rivers can reach? And yet, if waters can carry away the memories of silence, carving valleys and spreading the sediments of forgotten ages, then what of the ice itself? For rivers remember in motion, but glaciers remember in stillness. Their weight and silence are not only prisoners of the past, but sculptors of the present. Ice is not only a destroyer, it is an architect. Across millions of years, glaciers wrote their artistry into the flesh of continents, and what we now see is beauty. Fjords, moraines, winding valleys were once the scars of devastation. Creation and destruction shared the same hands. To picture this is to see the earth not as passive, but as canvas under pressure, yielding and breaking under the slow chiseling of glaciers. Mountains were ground into shapes impossible without ice. Valleys were pressed into graceful U-forms, their steep walls echoing with silence when the glaciers pulled away. Moraines, bulldozed ridges of rock and debris, remained as punctuation lines, marks of advance and retreat, bands of memory laid into soil. Every erratic boulder stranded in an open field, every striation scratched into granite by passing ice. Each one is testimony that beauty was born in grinding force. Could it be that what we call serenity in landscapes today is always the residue of violence endured long before us? Nowhere is this clearer than in fjords. Deep, narrow arms of the sea cutting into land as if continents had been sliced open by impossibly precise hands. These were sculpted when glaciers carved their way to sea level, their weight digging deeper, deeper, below where even rivers could flow. When the ice retreated and oceans returned, seawater filled those chasms. To us, they are breathless beauty, mirrors of sky and mountain. But to earth, they are scars that became art. Perhaps beauty is never pure creation, but always a consequence of endurance, a mark of what landscapes survived rather than what they avoided. And in moraines, the piled ridges left behind at glacier's edge, we find memory arranged almost deliberately. Long arcs of stone and clay, curved ribbons stretching across valleys, as though the glacier had placed a line and said, "Here I once stood. Here I pressed down. Here my silence ended." They are not dramatic sculptures, but quiet reminders, nearly invisible unless you know to recognize them. Yet once seen, they are everywhere, scattered across continents like underlines in a book too vast to read. Ice also gave us lakes, filling depressions gouged out by glacial tongues, pooling water where mountain cirques had been carved into amphitheaters of stone. Whole bodies of water owe their existence to the scars of retreating ice. Think of the Great Lakes in North America, monuments of water created not by generosity but by absence, by glaciers hollowing basins that were later refilled. Could it be that beauty and life itself are often byproducts of destruction, unintended gifts from silence breaking apart? Geologists tell us this with certainty, but the thought carries emotional resonance as well. Because when we stand before a tranquil fjord at dusk, or beside a clear mountain lake, or when we walk grassy ridges that were once moraines, we rarely connect them to violence. We see stillness, we see calm, we see beauty, and yet their origins lie in the force of silence pressing downward, in glaciers grinding mountains into submission across thousands of years. Ice erased, and in doing so, revealed. Perhaps this is what beauty really is, not the absence of fracture, but the arrangement of it into form. And this thought carries us further. Could it be that our own identities, too, are shaped like landscapes, scarred by pressure, hollowed into valleys, carved into new forms by forces we could not resist? What feels like devastation in one age may later hold the shape of beauty in another. Maybe we too endure glaciations of the self, only to discover long after that what was ground away left behind something fertile, something breathtaking. Ice does not decorate lightly. It remakes entire continents. It pushes mountains downward with such weight that the crust sinks. And when the ice retreats, the land rises again, rebounding toward balance. Even today, parts of Earth are still lifting after the weight of glaciers melted thousands of years ago, the crust slowly correcting itself like a note held long beyond its timing. This is beauty not in the instant, but in rhythm, the Earth sculpting and reshaping itself in cycles too long for us to fully perceive. And yet, those cycles shaped the spaces where entire civilizations would one day arise, valleys to farm, plains to walk, rivers to follow. We are children of ice, beneficiaries of its paradoxical artistry. So as we trace the fingerprints of glaciers across the land, reading fjords and moraines as signatures of their silent work, we feel both small and included. Small, because the hands that carved these landscapes were merciless forces far beyond our scale. Included, because their aftermath gave us the very ground we stand on, the very waters we drink from, the very soils in which we live and plant and breathe. Perhaps this is what it means to read Earth's autobiography. Not just to know that ice made beauty from devastation, but to realize we are part of that beauty, living within the lines it left behind. And yet, if even ice, with its merciless weight, can carve devastation into beauty, then perhaps it whispers something larger, something about us. For as we reflect on the frozen ages, we begin to see them not only as climates in stone, not only as shifts of atmosphere and sea, but as metaphors for identity. Because identity, like Earth itself, is never made in stillness. It is shaped through fractures. It is altered through freezes. It is renewed in moments of fragile thaw. And if the planet carries these restless rhythms across billions of years, then who are we to imagine ourselves untouched by the same patterns? Think of how ice presses into valleys, reshaping their form forever. In us too, pressure leaves marks. Loss, silence, moments when the warmth of life feels withheld. These are our personal glaciers. They close in suddenly, or arrive so slowly we only realize their scale when we are already beneath their weight. They strip away familiar contours, grind us down, press us inward. And yet, like the landscapes smoothed and hollowed by glaciers, we are sculpted into new shapes without realizing it. Could it be that identity, the quiet architecture of who we are, is less about what remains untouched and more about what survives the freeze. And like the planet we fracture, our lives are full of cracks. Moments when certainty gives way, when the surface splinters, when floods break loose as they did when glaciers retreated. We may think such cracks are ruin, but they are also release. They open passages we did not know were there. They create valleys where rivers of renewal can flow. Perhaps identity requires fracture in order to move, the way landscapes require glaciers to carve them into new beauty. Maybe it is not in spite of rupture that we discover ourselves, but because of it. There are freezes as well. Pauses in life where nothing seems to flow forward. Years where silence takes the shape of ice, where growth seems halted, buried beneath the weight of stillness. We are told to fear such freezes, as if pause is failure, as if immobility is loss. And yet the ice ages remind us of the paradox, that silence also protects. Beneath glaciers, lakes remained liquid, currents still pulsed. Life held on in crevices, awaiting the thaw. Could it be that our own freezes are not endings, but protective intervals, seasons of pause where something beneath survives quietly, patiently, waiting for light? Not because we are strong in those silences, but because endurance is quieter than we expect. And just as the planet carries fragile renewals after every advance of ice, so too do we. When thaw returns in our lives, in the form of healing or warmth or tentative possibility, identity does not spring outward whole and untouched. It returns in fragments with new scars, with rearrangements. Valleys form where mountains once stood. Rivers carve paths across unfamiliar terrain. We are not as we were before, but in that difference lies deep renewal. Our memory of the freeze never leaves us, but instead becomes foundation, shaping the identity that continues. Could it be that every rebirth is imperfect renewal, and that imperfection itself is what allows us to feel whole again? Entropy threads through these reflections, the quiet truth that everything tends toward change. We erode, we remember, we fracture, we form. Nothing in us, as in earth, remains untouched across time. But this is not despair, it is narrative. It is autobiography written not only across the skin of continents but across the quieter landscapes of self. The fragility we fear may in fact be the very mechanism that carries us forward. Perhaps that is why we find such comfort in seeing our story mirrored in the earth. Because when we look at glaciers carving, or rivers reawakening, or fossils emerging from silence, we recognize ourselves in them. The planet does not move with intention, and neither do we always, but in both, there is story nonetheless. Written in stone, written in memory, written in scars. The ice ages, for all their silence, remind us that memory is never erased. It is rearranged, waiting to be read in a new light. Could our lives be any different? So we drift between freeze and thaw, pause and renewal, devastation and beauty. Each cycle rearranges identity, the way it rearranges landscapes. And even in the deepest freezes, even in the coldest silences, something persists quietly. Something survives long enough to greet another thaw. And yet, if so much of Earth and of ourselves can be read in the frost, in the endurance of silence and the fragility of thaw, then we must ask a question both unsettling and strangely serene. Have the ice ages truly ended? Or is the warmth we know simply an interval, an intermission between greater silences, a breath between winters not yet gone? It is tempting to imagine history as cumulative, moving forward into something final. But the Earth does not think in lines. It moves in cycles. And a cycle, however quiet it may appear, always promises return. To dwell upon this is to step into deep time, where even the Earth's climate, so vast to us, wavers like a candle flame. For ice ages have not been singular events. They come and go, advancing and retreating in rhythm with the slow tilt of the planet, the stretching of its orbit, the dance of continents shifting into polar night. Glacial calendars are written not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years, their choreography steady, their tempo patient. Interglacial moments of warmth, like the one we inhabit now, are fragile pauses, interludes of breathing space between the march of advancing ice. The warmth we trust, the climate we call stable, is temporary, a transient kindness extended by forces far beyond us. Imagine the Earth as it might look if viewed not in our timescales but in its own. The advance of glaciers appears less as catastrophe and more as tide, flowing outward across continents, then withdrawing again, then flowing once more. And we, like small creatures upon a shoreline, mistake the retreat of a wave for its ending. But what if this warmth is only ebb? What if, even now, the ice waits with patience, its return as sure as its past arrivals? Scientific records offer glimpses into this rhythm. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica show repeating cycles, oxygen isotope patterns recording cold, then warm, then cold again. Layers of trapped carbon dioxide echo the same music. Sediments in deep oceans confirm it. Earth breathes in and out, its lungs made of ice. Each glaciation lasted tens of thousands of years, each interglacial relatively brief, almost fleeting. We are living inside such a breath now, inside an interval of warmth that has already lasted about 11,000 years. A long pause by our measure, but a blink against the billions behind it. Could it be that what we call Earth's present climate is not a stable home, but a narrow hallway between echoes? And still, even knowing this, we resist imagining the future as cold. Our minds seek permanence, but the record of geology whispers otherwise. The planet has frozen before. It will freeze again. Entropy ensures repetition, not because it favors ice, but because cycles always lean toward balance, and balance never stays still. If warmth accumulates, it dissipates. If ice retreats, it gathers once more. Perhaps this is why silence always returns, because nothing holds forever. Not warmth, not frost, not us. Yet here the paradox deepens. For unlike the forgotten ages, we are aware. We carry the power to alter atmospheres ourselves, to bend cycles artificially, to prolong warmth past its natural threshold. Already carbon dioxide levels surpass what the ice cores of 500,000 years can show. Pushing us into climates Earth has not rehearsed in recent history. Could this delay the ice's return? Could it rewrite cycles so deeply that glaciers hesitate, lost, while the world warms beyond pattern? And if so, are we breaking from rhythm or only creating another silence, another erasure of a different kind? What fascinates and unsettles at once is that either possibility, the return of ice or its postponement, means instability. If ice comes back, life must contract again into the margins, withdrawing into narrow refuges of warmth. If ice is held back, then heat itself becomes silence, erasing what cannot endure. Stability is illusion. Fragility is the rule. Perhaps that, above all, is the memoir ice teaches, that certainty is always provisional, that permanence is a mask we place upon change to ease our fragility. So we face forward, not in fear, but in wonder. What will Earth become? Perhaps glaciers will advance across the northern continents once more, slow rivers of silence sculpting beauty and devastation alike. Perhaps seas will lower, coastlines stretching outward, deserts transformed into sheets of snow. Perhaps civilizations, if they do survive into those distant cycles, will build upon floating ice shelves, or nestle into volcanic refuges, much as microbes once did. Or perhaps the opposite. Our interference may tip balance toward heat, ice lost almost completely, seas rising instead of falling, warmth converting old freezes into memory alone. Which of these futures awaits? How do we begin to measure ourselves inside such immensity? Maybe it is not for us to answer conclusively. Maybe it is enough to know that cycles remain, waiting, that in geologic thinking, warmth is always a pause, never forever. And just as identity is shaped by freezes and fractures, so too is our collective existence awaiting its next rearrangement, its next silence, its next possibility of rebirth. Could it be that what lies ahead is less extinction and more transformation? Another autobiography entry written by Earth, one beyond what we can yet imagine. And so, nestled within this fragile warmth, beneath skies we trust as ordinary and rivers we trust as stable, the quiet question lingers. Not whether ice will return, but when and how. Perhaps the intermission is short. Perhaps it is long. Perhaps we alter it, stretch it, break it. Maybe not. But what remains certain, whispered by isotopes, whispered by stone, whispered by memory locked in frost, is that silence always waits, always gathers, always returns in some form. And yet, if we already dwell in an interlude, if every climate we trust is only temporary, then perhaps the deeper meaning of frost lies not only in its inevitability, but in what it leaves behind within us. For the ice ages were not only chapters of loss, not only silences pressed across oceans and forests, they were teachers. The frost itself, patient and merciless, taught us something essential, that memory can be sculpted not just in warmth, but in cold, that beauty may come from stillness as much as from motion, that even when the world seemed most inhospitable, mystery endured. When we look back into the first great freezes, we do not simply see catastrophes carved into rock. We see lessons inscribed by ice onto valleys, ridges, rivers, even into life itself. The frost taught us humility, that survival is delicate, provisional, easily undone, and yet still astonishingly persistent. It taught us patience, that processes unfolding over millions of years can create outcomes beyond imagination. Fjords so vast they reframe what we call beauty, sediments so finely layered they become libraries of climates no words remember. And it taught us wonder, that silence, which we so often mistake for absence, is alive with unseen resilience, carrying life forward unseen until its return. Could it be that the deepest teacher is not abundance, but limitation? Not warmth, but cold? Frost sharpened our perception of fragility. Without ice, we might have believed the world permanent, forests eternal, oceans endless, climate inevitable. But when the seas froze, and the air thinned, and ecosystems faltered, it became clear that stability is an illusion. Stability requires constant balance, and balance is always in motion. In this way, ice handed Earth and all who would come after a lesson in humility. Maybe all memory is fragile, but fragility is not weakness. It is an invitation to care, to notice, to value. Ice reminded the planet not to take itself for granted. Perhaps it reminds us, too. And in silence, frost offered us reflection. Just as snow muffles sound, the ice ages muffled the Earth's voice, slowing rivers, stalling forests. In that deep quiet, survival shrunk itself small. Microbes folded into vent-warmed crevices, seeds held dormant, traces of life remained barely visible. Yet it was in that quiet that the greatest resilience was proven. Survival is not dramatic. Survival is quiet, steady, patient. Could this be the meaning behind the frost's lesson? That silence teaches persistence not by moving loudly, but by waiting, by enduring, by knowing how to last long enough for warmth to return. Even creation was taught differently in cold. Glaciers carved valleys not with rippling waters, but with weight, with pressure, with grinding over ages. Beauty was not granted, but earned, taken from devastation itself. And through this, frost taught us to see differently, that creation is often indistinguishable from destruction, and what we now call wonder was once catastrophe. Could this apply to us as well? That even our most difficult winters, personal or collective, carry the hidden potential to carve beauty into us, though we cannot see it at the time? And ice also carried forward mystery. Its layers preserved bubbles of sky older than memory. Its depths shelter lakes unseen for millions of years. It became a keeper of secrets, withholding entire archives of atmosphere, chemistry, and even life until the right tools, the right patience, revealed them. And still, much is hidden. What microbes slumber in locked reservoirs beneath the Antarctic sheets? What soft memories rest in brine sealed away, in sediments untouchable beneath kilometers of frost? Silence holds mystery as much as it holds erasure. And mystery itself is a kind of wonder, not because it gives answers, but because it keeps us looking. Perhaps that is why we feel awe not only at warmth and blossom, but at snowfields stretching without end. There is beauty not only in abundance, but in restraint. Beauty not only in what blooms, but in what pauses. When we watch snowflakes fall or see glaciers gleam under moonlight, we feel the strange comfort that Earth has lived before us through silences much greater than ours, that it has paused life and then renewed it again, countless times. Mystery endures inside the frost, and so long as mystery endures, wonder never disappears. So the frost became more than silence, more than survival, it became a teacher of perspective. It taught that identity, whether of planets or people, is sculpted as much by absence as by presence, as much by what fails as by what thrives. It taught that every age carries its own value, even those painted in coldest hues. And it taught us that wonder is not bound to heat or abundance. It is as alive in the shimmer of auroras above frozen deserts as in the forests singing with birds in midsummer. The frost that once threatened erasure is the same frost that left us landscapes of staggering beauty and lessons of immeasurable depth. And yet, if even silence teaches wonder, if even the coldest ages are not absence but instruction, then what might the next silence, the next frost, the next retreat of warmth be ready to teach us still?